They called her the nation's darling grandmother, but in the quiet corners of palaces there was another soundtrack to her life: the soft clink of pearls against unpaid bills. If you met her late in life, you met a small lady with a bright smile and a voice like warm tea. She could make a roomful of people feel personally noticed, even when she was exhausted, even when she had somewhere else she would rather be. That was her greatest gift and her most dangerous weapon. Because behind that smile lived a certainty that the world should arrange itself around her comforts, her tastes, her family, her bruised feelings. When it did not, she did not simply feel disappointed. She felt wronged. Her name was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. History would later rename her the Queen Mother and wrap her in sentiment, curls, and courage. But long before she became a symbol, she was a daughter of privilege who learned, very early, that charm can excuse almost anything, and that a grudge, held quietly, can last longer than love. She was born into a family that looked like the definition of old Britain, all carved stone, thick carpets, and the confidence of people who never check a price tag. Her father was Claude Bowes-Lyon, the Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn. His title alone sounded like a hallway lined with portraits. Her mother, Cecilia, carried herself with the steady certainty of a woman who knew the social order the way other people know the rules of gravity. The Bowes-Lyons had the sort of life that comes with multiple homes and a staff that moves like silent furniture. There was St. Paul's, Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, where weekends could be arranged around horses, gardens and house parties, and there was Glamis Castle in Scotland, heavier, older, and full of stories that were half history and half delicious nonsense. People whispered about secret rooms and old family mysteries. The details did not matter. What mattered was the atmosphere. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by the idea that some things are meant to be hidden, and that a family's power can live in what it refuses to explain. She was one child among many, the second youngest in a house bursting with brothers and sisters. In big families, the oldest children are drilled in duty, and the youngest are treated like toys. The second youngest often gets a different bargain: enough attention to feel adored, enough freedom to be bold. Elizabeth was bright, pretty, and very good at making adults laugh. She learned to tilt her head at just the right moment. She learned when to be playful and when to be solemn. She learned, without anyone spelling it out, that if you bring light into a room, people forgive you for taking up space. Her education was the kind that mattered in her world. She was taught to dance, to ride, to speak properly, to write letters that sounded effortless. She learned how to host, how to thank, how to keep a conversation floating even when the subject bored her. She also learned the unspoken rules: who deserved respect, who deserved politeness, and who deserved to be ignored. That last one is where her sweetness could sharpen. She did not need to insult anyone. She could simply let her attention drift away, and the person would feel it like a sudden chill. Then the Great War arrived, and even castles could not pretend the world was a polite drawing room. Glamis was used to house-wounded soldiers. Elizabeth did her part, offering comfort, fetching tea, smiling through the smell of antiseptic and pain. It is easy to paint this as pure saintliness, and there was compassion in her, certainly. But it was also a lesson in the strange power of sympathy. A young woman in a clean dress, leaning in to listen, could make a grown man cry. Elizabeth saw, in real time, what she could do to people simply by being present. She did not turn away from that power. She practiced it. When peace returned, Britain was hungry for pleasure again. Society restarted its old engine of dinners, dances, and weekends in country houses, where the walls had never heard the word rent. Elizabeth stepped into that world like it had been waiting for her. She had a laugh that carried. She had the kind of face that photographs kindly, and she had an instinct for making herself memorable without ever seeming desperate. In those years, a young woman's life was not only about enjoyment, it was also about the match. Elizabeth had options, and she knew it. Her family were not royal, but they were close enough to that orbit to breathe the same air. When you grow up with that proximity, you learn a particular kind of ambition. It is not always loud, and it is rarely confessed. It simply feels like the natural next step. Prince Albert, the Duke of York, was the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. He was not the shining heir. That was his older brother, Edward, the Prince of Wales, adored by crowds and photographed like a movie star. Albert was the quieter one, the dutiful one, the one who stood a little too straight and looked in big rooms as if he wished he could disappear behind a curtain. Albert also had a stammer. In a family whose job was to speak for the nation, it was an agony. You could feel, even if you were only watching from a distance, how hard he worked to seem steady. Some people mistook that for weakness. Elizabeth did not. She saw something else. She saw a man who could be shaped. Albert fell for her quickly. He liked her confidence, her softness over steel, the way she could make other people relax around him. And Elizabeth, of course, noticed the obvious. He was a prince. But what she noticed even more was his need. A woman who has always been admired can grow bored of admiration. Need is different. Need is sticky. Need makes people loyal. When Albert proposed, she refused him. It shocked people, because who says no to a royal prince? Elizabeth did, and she did it with a calm smile that made her refusal feel almost gracious. Later, she refused again. This has been treated as a romantic delay, as if she simply wanted to be sure. She may have had doubts, but the refusals were also a kind of test. She was seeing how badly he wanted her. She was also, whether she admitted it or not, teaching him their future rhythm. She would decide, and he would wait. Her hesitation was not foolish. Marrying into the royal family was not a fairy tale. It was a cage with velvet lining. There was Queen Mary, formidable and watchful, a woman who believed duty was a religion. There were courtiers who had served for decades and would not enjoy being managed by a new duchess, no matter how pretty. There was the public, endlessly curious and quick to judge. Elizabeth enjoyed her freedom. She enjoyed choosing her own friends, her own clothes, and her own days. She was not naive about what she would lose. And yet the pull was there. Status was oxygen in her world, and royal status was a whole different atmosphere. She could become a duchess, perhaps one day more. She could step into history and make it look as if she belonged there naturally. Most of all, she could take a man who adored her and turn that adoration into influence. When she finally accepted, it was with the quiet decisiveness of someone who had made a calculation and liked the answer. She would marry him, but she would not vanish into the system. She would learn the system, and then she would bend it until it felt like home. Their wedding in 1923 was celebrated as a national comfort. After war and grief, people wanted something clean and hopeful. Elizabeth gave them that, and she also gave them symbolism. She laid her bouquet at the tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey. It was a tribute, yes, and it was also a brilliant gesture. In one motion she tied herself to the nation's mourning and made herself feel, instantly, like a woman who understood what ordinary families had suffered. Elizabeth had always had an instinct for what would look sincere, and she could be sincerely moved and strategically smart at the same time. After the cheers faded, she became the Duchess of York and stepped into a life where her calendar belonged to other people. She had rooms in palaces and staff who appeared before she finished a sentence. She also had rules, endless rules. There were protocols about who entered first, where one stood, how a letter was addressed, when a visit was permitted. A woman raised with privilege does not like to feel managed, even when the management is disguised as tradition. Elizabeth learned quickly who had power in that household and how power moved. Some of it was official, the king, the queen, the senior courtiers. Some of it was intimate, the ladies who knew everyone's secrets, the private secretaries who controlled access, the servants who heard everything and remembered it. Elizabeth smiled at all of them. She listened. She made them feel valued. And she filed away their weaknesses like a collection. One of her first shocks was that royal magnificence had boundaries, and those boundaries were guarded by older people who believed they were guarding the soul of the monarchy. Even diamonds had rules. A new duchess might assume she could choose a necklace the way she might choose a hat, by taste and mood. In the palace, jewels were history, and history came with permissions. Queen Mary, who could inventory a tiara the way another woman inventories her spice rack, did not enjoy being surprised. Elizabeth had never been fond of being corrected, especially not in front of an audience. When Queen Mary offered advice, it was rarely phrased as a suggestion. It was delivered with a calm certainty that left no room for debate. Elizabeth's response was always sweet. She would agree, she would smile, she would promise to remember. Then later, she would do what she wanted, or she would do what she was told, but with a private sulk that lasted for days. She could be intensely loyal to the institution and still bristle at the people who assumed she should be grateful for discipline. She made 145 Piccadilly, their London home, into a place that felt more like her own world. She wanted softer rooms, comfortable chairs, flowers that looked freshly gathered, rather than arranged like a museum display. She wanted dinner parties that felt lively, not stiff. She wanted laughter at the table, and she wanted Albert to feel, for once, that he was not merely attending his life, but living it. That domestic warmth became part of her public appeal. It also gave her a private kingdom, and Elizabeth liked having a kingdom. To build that kingdom, she spent. Not in the crude way of someone showing off, but in the assured way of someone who believes quality is a duty. She favored the best dressmakers, the best fabrics, the best decorations. She did not see this as indulgence. She saw it as keeping standards. Yet Elizabeth's standards had a way of expanding to fill any available space. Albert hated fuss about money. It embarrassed him. He had been raised to believe that talking about costs was vulgar, and that owing people was humiliating. Elizabeth had been raised to believe that people of their class were not supposed to worry about such things. Put those two beliefs together, and you get a dangerous silence. Bills were handled by secretaries, accounts were smoothed over, and Elizabeth's taste continued to climb. She could be surprisingly hard on the staff when her comfort was disturbed. A maid who mislaid a glove, a footman who moved too slowly, a secretary who failed to arrange a favorite guest. These were not just mistakes. To Elizabeth, they could feel like personal disrespect. She would not shout. She would tighten her voice, and the room would go colder. Then she would be perfectly polite at the next official event, as if nothing had happened, leaving the unfortunate person to wonder what invisible line they had crossed. This is the paradox that made her so effective. She could be warm, and she could be punishing, sometimes in the same hour. She could charm a factory worker with genuine brightness, then turn around and dismiss a courtier with a look that said, without words, that they were beneath her. Albert increasingly let her manage the social side of their life. He needed her to buffer him from the public. He needed her to reassure him that he could do the job. And Elizabeth, who had never liked being powerless, discovered that she liked being indispensable. She also began to take a proprietary interest in the monarchy itself, as if she were already a guardian of its dignity. If something looked cheap, she hated it. If someone behaved casually, she judged it. She wanted the crown to feel elevated, but she also wanted the people to love her for making it feel close. It was a delicate performance, and she enjoyed it very much. Albert was relieved to have her. He clung to her confidence. When he was anxious about a public appearance, she steadied him. When his stammer humiliated him, she encouraged practice and sought help. She could be tender, and she could also be impatient in a way that stung. She had no appetite for being embarrassed, not by herself and not by the man beside her. If she pushed him, it was partly love and partly self-interest. A duchess can forgive many things. She does not forgive looking ridiculous. Their marriage worked because each gave the other something they craved. Albert gave her a platform so high she could see the whole kingdom. Elizabeth gave him a sense of being chosen, a warmth that made his life feel less like a grim assignment. It was affectionate and it was uneven. He adored, she directed. And then there was Edward. Edward, the Prince of Wales, was the family's glittering problem, handsome, restless, adored by the public and exhausting to his parents. He treated duty like a tedious chore and pleasure like a serious vocation. He collected fashionable friends and stayed out late. He charmed everyone, and he refused to be controlled. To many in Britain he was modern, thrilling, the future. To those inside the palace, he was a source of dread. Elizabeth watched him with the sharpened attention of a woman who understood that her own safety depended on his choices. If Edward married sensibly and produced heirs, Albert would remain the supportive brother, and Elizabeth could enjoy her position without the crushing weight of being near the throne. If Edward's private life became public disaster, the whole family would be dragged into it, and Albert might be pulled forward like an unwilling substitute. At first, Elizabeth played her role with polished ease. She laughed at Edward's jokes, praised his charm, and behaved like the affectionate sister-in-law the photographers wanted. In private, she could be far less amused. She had been raised to believe that the crown's value depended on propriety. Edward's loose behaviour felt not only reckless but insulting, as if he were squandering something she took almost reverently. Edward, for his part, was not blind to her. He enjoyed her sparkle, but he also sensed her steel. She had popularity that did not depend on him, and that can irritate a man used to being the centre of every room. More importantly, she had influence over Albert. For years, Edward had been the stronger brother by sheer force of personality. With Elizabeth at Albert's side, that balance began to shift in small, subtle ways. Those small shifts were everything. The royal family was not only a family, it was a business run on inheritance. Every dinner was also a negotiation. Every friendship was also a faction. Elizabeth understood this instinctively, and she began to build her position without ever admitting she was building anything at all. She cultivated the press, giving just enough access to create affection and withholding enough to keep control. She cultivated courtiers who liked her warmth and feared her displeasure. She cultivated, above all, an image, steady, domestic, dutiful, and quietly superior. Inside that image lived a stubborn streak that could turn quickly into resentment. She liked deference. She liked proper titles. She liked the old rules because the old rules put her exactly where she believed she belonged. If a courtier blocked her, she did not explode. She froze them out. If someone offended her, she did not argue. She remembered, and she waited for a moment to return the favour with perfect manners. By the mid-1920s, Elizabeth was settling into royal life as if she had always been meant to occupy it. She hosted, she appeared, she smiled, she made the monarchy look wholesome. Albert leaned on her more than ever. Grateful for her ease with people, grateful for her steadiness. And outside the palace walls, Edward was living as if consequences were something that happened to other families. Elizabeth could feel the future tightening like a corset. She did not yet know which woman, which scandal, which reckless decision would push Edward from charming to dangerous. But she could sense the storm building, and she had always known what to do when weather turns. Close the windows, secure the valuables, and make sure you are standing under the chandelier when everyone else starts to panic. She stayed under the chandelier all right, but she also made sure the chandelier belonged to her. In the years after her wedding, Elizabeth learned the palace the way a clever hostess learns a dining room. Not the obvious things, like where the silver was kept, but the true traffic. Who could interrupt the king without being announced? Which lady-in-waiting held grudges like heirlooms? Which private secretary could stop a request by simply forgetting it? In public, she played the grateful new duchess. In private, she had a way of saying, very softly, "That will not do," as if the world itself had just been caught behaving badly. Queen Mary watched her with a kind of chilly fascination. Mary had trained herself to swallow emotion for breakfast. She believed in duty so fiercely it had replaced affection. She also believed sincerely that she was preserving the monarchy by controlling the people closest to it. Elizabeth did not argue with her. She did something more dangerous. She made Mary feel just often. When an event needed warmth, Mary was not warm. Elizabeth was. When a crowd needed smiling, Mary was dignified, the sort of dignity that can look like disapproval. Elizabeth smiled as if she had been delighted to be there all her life. It did not take long for courtiers to whisper that the Duchess of York was a gift. It did not take long for Mary to notice that people were beginning to prefer the gift to the giver. Enough that Elizabeth was useful. Elizabeth took compliments as if they were perfectly natural, the way she took fresh flowers or a well-made cup of tea. She was not a woman who enjoyed being second. Even when she insisted she was happy in her role, you could feel the pride that rose in her when people praised her as a future queen. A phrase spoken lightly at dinners, half joke, half prophecy. She would laugh. She would wave it away. She would remember who said it. Albert was working harder than ever at appearing calm. His stammer haunted him. It was not just a speech problem. It was humiliation that arrived in his mouth. When he anticipated a word he might trip on, his whole face tensed, and Elizabeth could see it before anyone else did. She could see the panic building in him like steam in a kettle. In those moments, she was sometimes tender. She would squeeze his arm and murmur, "Slowly, darling." Other times, when she felt exposed by his struggle, her support could turn sharp. Her eyes would narrow slightly and the message was clear. "Do not embarrass me." There was a man, a speech therapist named Lionel Logue, who became quietly important in their lives. Logue was not a courtier, and that was part of his power. He was not impressed by titles, and he was not frightened by royal moods. He treated Albert like a person who needed help, not like a prince who needed applause. Elizabeth, who could be intimidating in a roomful of staff, found that Logue did not bend to her. It bothered her, and appealed to her at the same time. She respected people who stood firm, as long as they stood firm for her. She also enjoyed being the rescuer. It let her feel noble. She threw herself into Albert's progress like a commander taking a hill. Practice, discipline, appointments, encouragement, pressure. If Albert faltered, she urged him on. If he succeeded, she glowed with pride that felt almost proprietary, as if she had personally manufactured his courage. When he spoke a sentence smoothly, her face lit up with something close to triumph. This was her husband, her project, her proof. And while she was polishing Albert into a credible public figure, she was also doing something else, quieter, but just as ambitious. She was building herself into the kind of woman people wanted to love. In 1926, she gave birth to her first daughter, Elizabeth. The baby was small and solemn, with an expression that made nurses laugh. The Duchess of York was suddenly the mother of a child who was, at that moment, third in line to the throne. That fact hung in the air like perfume. Officially, it changed nothing. Edward was young and healthy, and everyone assumed he would marry and have children. But royal families are not built on assumptions. They are built on the cold truth that accidents happen, and habits ruin people, and history does not always wait for someone to feel ready. Elizabeth took to motherhood with a kind of fierce possessiveness. She adored her baby. She also adored what the baby represented. A child made her look more settled, more respectable, more essential. It softened her, at least to the public. The smiling Duchess with the bright eyes became the smiling Duchess with a nursery. People melted. Elizabeth let them. Privately, she was not a soft mother. She was loving, yes, but love in her world came with rules. A child should behave. A child should not whine. A child should learn early who is in charge. She could be playful with little Elizabeth, but she could also be brisk, even with a baby, as if she expected the infant to understand expectations. The staff learned quickly that the Duchess wanted everything done her way, and that she would notice if it was not. There is a particular kind of spoiled that does not look like tantrums. It looks like assuming other people exist to prevent discomfort. Elizabeth's discomfort could be tiny, a room too warm, a schedule too crowded, a guest who talked too much. When those irritations appeared, her mood shifted. She did not shout. She became icy. It could feel worse than shouting because there was no release. The staff would scramble, terrified of displeasing her, while she stood perfectly composed and let the tension do the punishing for her. Albert often smoothed things over. He hated conflict. He hated scenes. He would apologize to a servant quietly later, in that awkward way of his that suggested he was both embarrassed and grateful. Elizabeth rarely apologized. She did not think she should have to. If she was unhappy, someone had failed her. That was the logic of a woman raised to be served and then placed in a life. where service was limitless. Her spending continued, and motherhood did not slow it. If anything, it gave her new arenas. Baby clothes had to be perfect. Nurseries had to be lovely. Gifts had to be generous. She was not careless. She was simply convinced that beauty and quality were necessities. If accounts showed strain, she avoided looking too closely. There would always be a way. There was always a way for people like her, until suddenly there is not. Meanwhile, Edward kept dazzling the public and alarming the palace. He loved the modern world, the fast cars, the bright nights, the set of glamorous people who treated rules like quaint furniture. He visited factories and shook hands, and crowds adored him. He also pursued married women with the casual confidence of a man who believed the world existed for his pleasure. Elizabeth watched his romantic life the way a mother watches a child playing too close to a cliff. She did not like his taste in women, and she liked even less the fact that he seemed to enjoy offending the older generation. Queen Mary was outraged. King George V was furious in that silent, volcanic way of his. But Edward had a talent for skating away from consequences. He would charm, he would promise, he would vanish again. At family gatherings, the tension could be almost funny if it were not so dangerous. Edward would stroll in late, looking immaculate, as if he had been tailored by the gods. He would kiss his mother's hand. He would say something charming to Elizabeth, something that sounded like praise but carried a hidden pin. Elizabeth would smile brightly and answer in the same language. 2 polite sentences, both sharp, both sugar-coated. Albert sat between them sometimes, caught like a nervous child between confident adults. Elizabeth would place her hand on his arm, a gesture of affection that also served as a reminder. He belonged to her. Edward would notice, of course. Edward noticed everything. King George V's health was not perfect, and the family could feel time moving. The king's reign had been built on steadiness. He had survived war and upheaval by clinging to routine and respectability. He expected his heirs to continue the same performance. With Edward, he saw a threat. With Albert, he saw a backup he did not entirely trust, not because Albert was irresponsible, but because Albert was fragile. Elizabeth began to insert herself into these worries. Not openly, never openly. But she offered opinions, gentle ones, delivered in her most reasonable tone. She spoke of duty. She spoke of the monarchy's image. She spoke of what people needed to believe. She made herself sound like the sensible heart of the family. It was a role she enjoyed. It made her feel powerful without looking ambitious. There were also the politics of popularity, which Elizabeth understood almost instinctively. The monarchy depended on affection, and affection can be fickle. Edward had the crowd's passion. Elizabeth had their comfort. It is a different kind of love, steadier, more forgiving. She leaned into it. She visited hospitals. She spoke with widows. She smiled at children and made them feel chosen. She did not do this because she was pretending. She could be genuinely moved by suffering. She also knew exactly how useful that image would be if the family ever needed a moral center. By 1930, she had her second daughter, Margaret. The baby was lively, a little spark of mischief even in infancy. Elizabeth found Margaret's sweetness easier to enjoy because it felt more like her own style of charm. Little Elizabeth, the older child, was serious and watchful. Elizabeth sometimes looked at her with a strange mix of affection and unease, as if she sensed something already. A child who observes quietly can become a judge, and Elizabeth did not enjoy being judged. The girls were adored by the public, and Elizabeth guarded them fiercely. She did not want them overexposed. She did not want them treated like props. At the same time, she was happy for the nation to see enough to fall in love. She understood, almost instinctively, that the royal family's most powerful currency was not gold. It was intimacy. A glimpse of bedtime stories, a wave from a balcony, a photograph of a small hand holding a mother's finger. Elizabeth gave these glimpses carefully, like a woman offering samples in a fine shop, just enough to make people want more. Inside the family, alliances shifted. Queen Mary maintained her grip. She believed she was the guardian of tradition, but even Mary could not ignore the changing world. The newspapers were hungrier. The public wanted access, society was loosening, and the monarchy could not stay entirely stiff without risking irrelevance. Elizabeth was part of that adjustment. She knew how to appear modern without truly changing. She could give the impression of approachability while still insisting on every privilege behind closed doors. There were moments when her spite showed, not in grand scandals, but in small acts of social control. If someone displeased her, invitations stopped. A person would simply vanish from her orbit, and soon they would notice doors closing elsewhere too. Elizabeth did not need to issue orders. She simply shifted her attention, and the court followed. People like to be on the side of warmth. They also fear the cold. Albert's duties increased. He was sent on tours, asked to represent the king, expected to speak more often. Each public appearance was a test, and Elizabeth treated those tests like battles. She coached him, encouraged him, and sometimes scolded him. She wanted him to succeed, but she also wanted the credit for his success. When he was praised for a speech, she smiled as if she were proud. In private, she could say, "You see, you can do it when you listen." It was affectionate, but it also carried that quiet message. Without me, you would not manage. Albert, for all his shyness, was not entirely blind. There were nights when he looked exhausted, when he seemed to shrink under the weight of expectations and the sharpness of his wife's standards. He would sit with his head in his hands, and Elizabeth would walk into the room briskly, full of plans, full of arrangements, full of what needed to happen next. Sometimes he would flinch, just slightly, as if bracing for disappointment. And then she would soften. She would kneel beside him, take his hands, and look into his face with that bright tenderness that made people forgive her. "My darling," she would say, and you could almost believe she meant it in a simple, uncomplicated way. Perhaps she did. Perhaps her love and her ambition were, braided together so tightly she could not tell where one ended and the other began. Outside the palace, the world was struggling. The economic downturn hit Britain hard. There were unemployed men in the streets, families scraping by. The contrast between that hardship and royal life could have been explosive. Elizabeth knew it. She also knew that if the monarchy looked careless, it could be punished by public anger in ways that were not merely embarrassing. So she tightened the performance. More visits, more sympathy, more careful speeches about resilience and courage. She had a gift for sounding sincere because she could feel, in a real way, the emotion she was presenting. But she did not let that emotion change her taste. She might talk about sacrifice and then return to a palace where the curtains alone could feed a family for a year. The contradiction did not trouble her the way it might trouble someone raised without such insulation. In her mind, the monarchy's splendor was part of its purpose. It was supposed to be above. It was supposed to be steady. If the country suffered, the crown had to look unshaken. That was her justification, and she believed it. But she also enjoyed the splendor. She enjoyed the way people stepped back for her. She enjoyed the way her name opened doors. She enjoyed the way servants anticipated her needs. There is a line between duty and indulgence, and Elizabeth crossed it so often she stopped seeing it. Edward's private life grew more complicated, and it began to taste like trouble. He was drawn to women who were not available, who were already married, who lived in a world of cocktail parties and whispered arrangements. He liked the thrill of secrecy. He liked being adored. He also liked defying his parents, as if their disapproval proved his freedom. Elizabeth disliked these women intensely, and not only because they were potential scandals. They represented a kind of confidence she did not control. They had Edward's attention, and Edward's attention mattered. If they influenced him, they could influence the future of the monarchy. Elizabeth did not want the future shaped by women she considered vulgar, or worse, women who did not know their place. At the same time, she was not above using the very thing she condemned. She could flirt when it suited her. She could charm men in power. She could make alliances through laughter and attention. The difference, in her mind, was that she did it within the rules, or at least within a version of the rules that protected her. Edward's affairs threatened the institution. Her social games strengthened it. That was how she told the story. There were also rumors, the sort that swirl around any royal court, about Elizabeth's own friendships and attachments. She had male friends she enjoyed, men who admired her, men she kept close. The palace was a place where everyone watched everyone, where a lingering glance could become a whispered narrative by dessert. Elizabeth handled gossip the way she handled everything, with a smile that made it feel ridiculous, and with just enough distance to keep it from sticking. Still, she was careful. She had seen what happened to women who looked careless. Society could forgive a prince. It was less forgiving to a duchess. Her real passion, if we are honest, was not romance. It was control. It was being the center of a room without appearing to demand it. It was having people eager to please her, and she had a particular delight in winning battles without anyone realizing a battle had occurred. One evening, at a dinner where Edward was being particularly dazzling, Elizabeth sat across from him and watched him toy with the table's attention. He told stories, made people laugh, leaned in close to a beautiful woman as if the rest of the room did not exist. Elizabeth listened, smiling, but her eyes did not soften. When Edward's glance flicked toward her, she answered with a look that could have been affectionate if you did not know how to read it. It said quietly, "I see you. I see the danger. I will not let you burn us all down." Edward, who was not a man easily unsettled, paused for a fraction of a second. He lifted his glass in her direction, a small salute that could have meant anything. Elizabeth lifted hers back, the perfect hostess, the perfect sister-in-law. Under the sparkle, it was a duel. Albert sensed it. He always sensed tension, even when he did not understand it. After the guests left, he asked Elizabeth cautiously if she thought Edward was going too far. Elizabeth's answer was light. "Oh, Bertie, he always goes too far. That is his charm." Then her tone changed, just slightly. "But charm is not a plan." Albert looked at her, worried. He did not want to think about the throne. He did not want to imagine himself in the role his brother was meant to take. He wanted his life to be manageable, his duties predictable, his family safe. Elizabeth reached for his hand and held it firmly. "We do what we must," she said. And in that moment you could hear something in her voice that sounded like bravery. You could also hear something else, the faintest note of anticipation, like a woman who has been told she might be needed and finds that she likes the sound of it. She kissed his cheek, neat and reassuring, and then she went to check on the children, moving through the palace corridors as if she owned them. In the nursery, little Elizabeth was asleep, her small face serious even in rest. Margaret lay sprawled, one arm flung out like a dancer. Elizabeth looked at them for a long moment, and her expression softened. Then she adjusted a blanket with unnecessary precision, as if even sleep needed to be arranged properly. Outside, somewhere in the city, people were struggling to pay rent, to find work, to keep warm. Inside, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon stood over her daughters like a queen in waiting, and the future, heavy and impatient, began to press its hand against the door. The future pressed its hand against the door more often after that, not with one loud knock, but with a steady tapping that made it impossible to pretend you had not heard it. Elizabeth kept busy on purpose. If she stayed busy, she did not have to sit still long enough to imagine her life changing in ways she could not control. She arranged visits, chose flowers, planned dinners, and managed Albert with the careful attention of a woman keeping a fragile vase upright on a crowded table. She learned which days his nerves were worst, which officials made him tense, which faces in a crowd made him stumble. She learned how to position herself half a step behind him so the public saw support, not dominance, and how to lean in close enough that he could catch her calm like a borrowed breath. In private, she was less gentle. If he practiced with Lionel Logue and grew frustrated, she insisted he continue. If he lost patience, she told him he could not afford to indulge it. If he wanted to disappear from public view, she reminded him that disappearing was not an option for people born into this family. Her voice could be honey, but it could also be a clean blade. The strange thing was that Albert accepted both. He had been raised by a father who believed tenderness produced weakness. He did not expect comfort without effort. Elizabeth offered him both, but always on her terms. They escaped London whenever they could, to the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park, where the air felt less heavy and the rooms felt less like a museum. Elizabeth worked hard to make that house feel warm. She had little chintz chairs and soft lamps, a nursery that smelled of powder and books, and a drawing room where guests were encouraged to laugh rather than sit like statues. It was not just taste, it was strategy. If the monarchy ever needed to look human, the York household could provide a ready-made picture. A dutiful couple, two charming little girls, a home that looked like a storybook rather than an institution. The public loved it. So did the newspapers. In the careful, respectful way newspapers love a royal who gives them just enough. Elizabeth understood that it was better to be seen occasionally and chosen than to be seen constantly and picked apart. She made appearances feel like gifts. She had learned in childhood that attention is more valuable when it is not cheap. And yet, behind the curtains, there was always the same old issue: money. Not money as a threat to survival, but money as a threat to pride. Elizabeth liked things done properly, which to her meant beautifully, which often meant expensively. She liked the best fabrics. She liked good food and plenty of it. She liked staff who moved quickly and anticipated her preferences. She liked being surrounded by the kind of ease that tells you without words that you are safe from ordinary problems. If anyone tried to suggest restraint, she reacted as if they had insulted her character. She did not see spending as waste. She saw it as maintaining standards. Standards were not optional in her mind. Standards were what separated her from the crowd. When she was younger, the crowd was simply less grand. Now the crowd was the whole nation, watching and judging. She did not intend to be the royal who looked cheap. The country, of course, was living through hard years. There were men who could not find work, mothers who lined up for assistance, families who stretched meals like cloth. Elizabeth did not walk past that suffering with a cold heart. She could be genuinely affected by it, and she could be sincerely kind in a hospital ward. But she also believed, with the stubborn certainty of her class, that the crown must not look diminished. If the monarchy looked poor, it would not look noble. If it did not look noble, why would anyone keep it at all? That was her logic, and it allowed her to hold sympathy in one hand and a new gown in the other without feeling she was betraying anyone. Edward was betraying everyone, at least in the opinion of the palace, and he did it with that glittering smile that made strangers forgive him before he even asked. The Prince of Wales had become a legend in his own lifetime. Women fainted when he passed. Men wanted to drink with him, to imitate him, to borrow his effortless confidence. He wore his clothes as if he had been born in them. He could make a room roar with laughter, then turn suddenly quiet and intense with a woman at his side. He was, in public, the future of the monarchy. In private, he was the reason older courtiers kept smelling salts close by. He did his duties, but as if they were something he had agreed to briefly, not something he owed. He toured factories and spoke to unemployed men, and he could seem sincerely moved in those moments. But when the cameras were gone, he drifted back to his other life, a life of weekend houses, late nights, married women and friends who treated rules like a joke shared over champagne. Elizabeth watched him with a growing anger that she kept carefully wrapped. She hated the risk he represented. She also, if she was honest, hated the way he got away with it. Edward could behave badly and still be adored. She had to behave perfectly to keep her place. It felt unfair, and Elizabeth did not like unfairness unless she was the one benefiting from it. Albert tried not to dwell on Edward. It made him anxious. He loved his brother, in that loyal way the second son often loves the first. He also resented him quietly for making their parents miserable and for forcing Albert to imagine responsibilities he did not want. Elizabeth did not allow Albert to hide from the topic. She would bring Edward up in conversation at just the right moments, in a tone that sounded casual but carried a purpose. He is being reckless. He is surrounding himself with the wrong people. He is forgetting who he is. She never said, "He is clearing the path for us." She did not need to. The thought hovered anyway, and it made Albert look away, ashamed of even considering it. Then, in the early years of the 1930s, a new name began to drift through the social world, spoken first as a curiosity, then as a warning. Wallace Simpson, She was American, which already made her suspicious in certain circles. She was sharp, stylish, and social in a way that was not British at all. She did not soften herself to be liked. She did not pretend to be impressed. She had divorced one husband and married another, and she moved through high society with the fearless confidence of a woman who had already broken the rules and discovered the sky did not fall. The first time Elizabeth heard about Wallace, it was in the tone people use when they want to be thrilling but discreet. A friend mentioned a clever American woman, married, amusing, a little too bold. Someone else laughed about her voice, her confidence, her way of looking at men as if she were evaluating them. Elizabeth smiled as if she was entertained. Inside, she felt the familiar prick of alarm. Edward did not choose calm women. He chose women who made the room tilt. At first, Wallace was just another figure in the Prince of Wales' social orbit. Another woman who might flirt and then vanish. The palace had seen plenty of those. But Wallace did not vanish. She stayed, and the longer she stayed, the more Edward seemed to revolve around her. Friends began to notice that he looked for her in a room the way a thirsty man looks for water. They noticed that he repeated her jokes as if they were brilliant, that he listened to her opinions as if they mattered, that he became impatient when she was not there. Elizabeth heard these details and felt her stomach tighten. A married woman was one problem. A married woman who could hold Edward was a larger one. A married woman with a past that could not be scrubbed clean was a disaster waiting to happen. Elizabeth did not need to meet Wallace to decide she disliked her. She disliked her on principle. She disliked her because she was American, because she was divorced, because she had the nerve to be confident around royalty. She disliked her because Edward seemed willing to be led, and Elizabeth believed only certain people had the right to lead in that family. She believed quite firmly that she was one of those people. Queen Mary disliked Wallace as well, but Mary disliked most people who threatened her sense of order. The difference was that Mary thought in terms of tradition, while Elizabeth thought in terms of survival. Mary wanted Edward to behave because it was correct. Elizabeth wanted Edward to behave because if he did not, the whole family could be dragged down, and she had too much invested in the family to watch it collapse. King George V, meanwhile, was growing older, and age did not soften him. It made him more impatient. He had always believed in duty like a creed. As his health began to fail, his worry about Edward sharpened. He wanted to see his heir settled properly, married to a suitable woman, producing the next generation. The palace was full of quiet schemes to introduce Edward to the right young women. The right young women were carefully chosen, well-born, obedient, and not particularly interesting to a man like Edward. Edward, of course, did not cooperate. He had been indulged too long. His charm had protected him too often. He treated the pressure to marry as an annoyance, a dull conversation repeated by older people who did not understand him. He also believed in his bones that he could always get what he wanted. That belief had been confirmed so many times it had become part of his identity. Elizabeth watched the family attempt to manage Edward and saw how weak their tools really were. You cannot scold a man who has never truly been punished. You cannot threaten a man who believes the world will bend. The only thing that could stop Edward was Edward himself, and Elizabeth did not trust his self-control. So she focused on what she could control. She tightened her own circle. She made sure her friends were loyal. She made sure the York household looked impeccable. She encouraged Albert to accept more duties, not fewer. She made him practice speaking until his jaw hurt and his temper frayed. She pushed him toward competence, because competence could become a shield if the family ever needed another man to stand firm. There were moments when Albert bristled. He would say in a tired voice that he did not want to be in competition with his brother. Elizabeth would answer sweetly that it was not competition, it was service. Then she would add, very softly, that the country needed stability and someone must provide it. Albert would look at her, conflicted. He knew she was right, and he also suspected she was eager. That suspicion made him uncomfortable because he loved her, and because he did not want to think ill of her, and because part of him feared she had always been just a little more ready for the crown than he was. Elizabeth was ready in the way a woman is ready for a thing she will never admit she wants. She was ready to be important. She was ready to be necessary. She was ready to be admired and obeyed on a scale that made every earlier triumph look like a parlor game. She was also ready to be wronged, because she could already sense, in the way Edward was moving, that she might soon have to fight for the monarchy itself. When she did finally meet Wallace, it was in a social setting where everyone pretended nothing was unusual. That is how the upper class handles danger. They dress it up, invite it to dinner, and then judge it silently over soup. Wallace was smaller than Elizabeth expected, quick in her movements, with eyes that seemed to measure people. She did not look like a romantic heroine. She looked like a woman who had learned how to survive. She spoke crisply, laughed without apology, and did not fold herself into humility. She treated Elizabeth with a kind of polite warmth that was almost maddening, because it offered no obvious excuse for hostility. Elizabeth responded with perfect charm. She could be delightful when she wanted. She could make conversation sing, she could laugh and praise and make Wallace feel, at least on the surface, welcome. That was the danger of Elizabeth. She could dislike you intensely while making you feel personally appreciated. She did not show her teeth. She hid them behind a smile. Afterward, when they were alone, Elizabeth said very little. She did not need to perform outrage for Albert. She simply said, in that calm tone that made her sound reasonable even when she was furious, that Edward was making a fool of himself. Albert sighed, a long, tired sound. He did not want to argue. He did not want to think about it. He wanted Edward to come to his senses. Elizabeth wanted Edward to come to his senses too, but she did not believe in hoping. She believed in preparing. And while she prepared, the wider world was shifting in ways that made the palace feel less secure than it liked to admit. Political tensions rose across Europe. Extremes grew louder. People began to question institutions that had once seemed unshakable. The monarchy needed to look not only glamorous, but solid. Edward looked glamorous. Elizabeth looked solid. She leaned into that solidity with a devotion that could be impressive if you did not notice how much she enjoyed it. She visited women and children. She spoke about family, stability, courage. She made herself into a figure people could cling to. She did not do it by preaching. She did it by behaving as if she understood. She had a gift for making her sympathy feel personal, and a gift for making people forget that she had never stood in their shoes. In the York household, the children grew, and the shape of their personalities began to emerge more clearly. Little Elizabeth, the older girl, was quiet, dutiful, already careful about pleasing. She watched adults and seemed to take note of their moods. She was not a child who threw herself around. She sat properly, spoke politely, and held herself with a seriousness that made people smile. Elizabeth, her mother, was proud of this, and also occasionally irritated by it. A child who is always proper can make a mother feel exposed. There is nowhere to hide your own faults when your daughter behaves like a judge in lace socks. Margaret was different. Margaret was sparkle, mischief, quick affection, quick sulks, and a talent for performing. She could charm a room the way Elizabeth could, with laughter and bright eyes. Elizabeth found Margaret easier, perhaps because Margaret felt like an extension of her own gifts. She indulged Margaret more, and she scolded her more too, because it was harder to tolerate mischief in a child who reminded her of herself. The household ran on patterns that suited Elizabeth. Staff knew to keep the rooms at the right temperature. They knew which dishes she liked. They knew that a small mistake could bring a look that made the day unpleasant for everyone. Elizabeth expected efficiency. She expected loyalty. She also expected admiration, and she could sense when admiration slipped into mere obedience. She did not like mere obedience. She wanted warmth with her service, devotion with her duty. When she was displeased with someone, she could be spiteful in the most elegant way. A lady who annoyed her might find herself no longer invited to the most pleasant gatherings. A courtier who challenged her might find his requests delayed, his access reduced, his influence quietly diminished. Elizabeth did not shout or scheme loudly. She simply turned her attention away, and in a court built on attention, that was punishment. People around her learned to anticipate her moods, and some found that exhausting. Others found it thrilling. There is always a certain type of person who loves serving power up close, even when it burns. Elizabeth could burn. She could also glow, and those who basked in her glow often forgave the scorch. In 1934, another royal marriage brought a new wave of glamour into the family. Prince George, the Duke of Kent, married Princess Marina, a beautiful princess with a modern elegance that made photographers nearly faint. Marina was stylish, poised, and adored. She became the kind of princess the public loved. Youthful, romantic, picture-perfect. Elizabeth smiled and welcomed her, because that is what you do. Privately, she was not pleased. It was not that she disliked Marina as a person. It was that Marina drew attention, and Elizabeth did not like sharing attention. She had worked hard to become the warm face of the royal family. A new princess with fresh glamour threatened to pull that spotlight away. Elizabeth responded the way she always did. She doubled down. More appearances, more charm, more carefully cultivated domestic scenes. She was not going to be outshone in her own family, not by a younger woman, not by anyone. Edward, meanwhile, grew more openly attached to Wallis. Friends began to whisper that it was not just an affair, it was an obsession. He brought her into circles where she should not have been. He included her in private gatherings. He listened to her. He seemed to need her approval. The more the palace disliked her, the more Edward seemed to cling to her, as if defiance had become part of his love. Elizabeth watched this and felt fury rise in her like heat. She could not understand it. Not because she could not understand desire, but because she could not understand giving someone that much power when the cost was so high. Edward was risking the crown, the family, the stability of the monarchy, for a woman who could not be accepted. It felt to Elizabeth like an insult to duty, to tradition, and to the sacrifices she believed she was making by living within the rules. She took that insult personally, because she always took threats personally. If Edward brought scandal, it would stain everyone. It would stain her daughters. It would stain Albert. It could even stain the monarchy in a way that made the public question why they should keep it. Elizabeth did not want to be the woman who watched the family sink. She wanted to be the woman who held it together. She began to talk more seriously with Albert about what might happen. Albert resisted. He did not want to imagine his brother failing. He did not want to imagine himself stepping forward. He did not want to imagine Elizabeth as queen, not because he doubted her ability, but because he feared what it would cost them. Elizabeth did not frame it as desire. She framed it as duty. She told him they must be ready, just in case. She told him the country needed stability, and that he could provide it if he had to. She told him they owed it to the king. She told him they owed it to their children. Albert listened, and his face tightened, and he went back to his speech exercises with a new kind of grimness. He was a man who did what he believed was required, even when it frightened him. Elizabeth knew that about him. She relied on it. King George V grew weaker. His health faltered in ways the palace tried to hide, but you could see it if you looked. His step was slower. His face looked heavier. His temper was sharper, because he could feel his strength slipping, and he did not enjoy weakness. Queen Mary remained rigid, refusing to acknowledge what everyone knew. A royal family does not talk about illness. It smiles through it. The king worried about Edward, and he did not hide that worry from those close to him. There were tense conversations, stern instructions, frustrated silences. Edward, stubborn and proud, reacted badly to pressure. He did not like being managed. He did not like being told his private life belonged to anyone else. He did not accept that a king cannot marry any woman he chooses without consequences. He thought love should be enough. He also thought he was exceptional. Elizabeth found that belief infuriating. She believed the crown was exceptional, not the man wearing it. She believed the person must bend to the institution, not the institution to the person. That was the fundamental difference between Edward and Elizabeth, and it was a difference that could only end in collision. As the year 1935 arrived, the palace moved with a strange double rhythm. Outwardly, it was business as usual. Ceremonies, visits, public events. Inwardly it felt like waiting for the king to recover, though he would not. Waiting for Edward to behave, though he might not. Waiting for the inevitable, though no one wanted to name it. Elizabeth attended events with her bright smile and her carefully chosen hats. She played the role of supportive daughter-in-law, devoted wife, loving mother. She did it so well that many people believed the role was her entire personality. That was exactly what she wanted. At home, she paid close attention to every shift in the family weather. She listened to rumors about Edward and Wallis. She noted which courtiers looked worried. She noticed which politicians began to appear more frequently, their faces serious, their voices low. She watched Albert grow tenser, and she pushed him gently, relentlessly, toward readiness. One evening, after a long day of duties, Elizabeth sat with Albert in a quiet room and spoke more plainly than usual. She told him that the country would not accept a king who humiliated the crown. She told him that Edward might force a crisis. She told him that if that happened, they could not wobble. They could not hesitate. They would have to step forward cleanly and firmly, like people who had been born for the task. Albert stared at the fire, his hands clenched. He said in a small voice that he did not want it. Elizabeth reached for his hand, and her touch was steady. She said she did not want it either. She said it was not about wanting. It was about doing what must be done. The words sounded dutiful, but there was something in her eyes that did not look like dread. It looked like focus. It looked like a woman who has spent years being told where she stands, and is now watching the ground shift in a way that might finally place her exactly where she believes she belongs. Outside, the country moved toward Christmas. Lights in windows, cold streets, prayers for better times. Inside the royal family, the air grew heavier with each week. King George V, stubborn to the end, pushed himself through official duties with a kind of grim pride. Edward continued his reckless devotion. Wallis remained in his orbit like a spark in dry grass. Elizabeth kept smiling. She kept hosting. She kept guiding Albert. She kept the York household looking warm and stable, as if stability were a thing she could manufacture by sheer will. And as the king grew weaker, as whispers turned more urgent, Elizabeth began to understand that the future was not just tapping at the door anymore. It was already turning the handle. It was already turning the handle, and the first thing that happened was not a scandal or a shouting match. It was silence. In the winter of 1936, the king retreated to Sandringham, as he always did when he needed rest. Sandringham was meant to be comfort. Familiar rooms, familiar routines, the sort of place where a man could pretend he was simply a stubborn country gentleman, not the symbol of an empire. But King George V did not look like comfort anymore. He looked like a man carrying a heavy coat he could no longer lift. The palace staff moved with a special kind of hush. Trays appeared and vanished. Doors closed softly. Even the clock seemed to tick more carefully. When you have lived your whole life in an institution that refuses to speak of weakness, illness becomes a theatre. Everyone knows the plot. No one says the lines out loud. Elizabeth came and went during that time with the dutiful face she wore so well. She was a daughter-in-law, attentive, sympathetic, never dramatic. She knew how to stand at the edge of a room and make herself look both present and respectful. She would inquire quietly, offer to help, then retreat before anyone could accuse her of hovering. She was not the sort of woman who wanted to be seen scrambling. She wanted to be seen steady. Albert was not steady. He tried, of course, because trying was his whole personality, but you could hear it in the way he breathed, in the way his hands tightened and loosened again. This was his father, stern and demanding and never easy to please, and Albert loved him in that aching way sons love fathers they fear. He also feared what his father's death would mean for them all. Queen Mary held herself like stone. She had lived too long inside the crown to allow herself the luxury of visible panic. She sat close to the king, read to him, adjusted his pillows, pressed his hand, and kept her face composed as if composure could keep him alive. When she spoke, it was to give instructions. When she listened, it was to evaluate. Grief, for Mary, was something you managed privately, like a hemline. Edward arrived with the air of a man who believed the world would wait for him. Even in the face of his father's decline, he carried himself with a restless impatience that made older courtiers wince. He was affectionate when it suited him. He could be tender, even sincerely tender, leaning in close, speaking softly. Then he would drift away to pace, to smoke, to complain about doctors, to complain about arrangements, to complain about anything that made him feel trapped. Elizabeth watched Edward during those days and felt something cold settle in her chest. He was about to become king, whether he wanted to or not, and he still behaved like someone who thought his real life was elsewhere. That casual distance, that belief that duty was a costume he could remove, frightened her more than any loud rebellion could have. One evening, when the corridors were quiet and the household seemed to hold its breath, Elizabeth passed Queen Mary in a doorway. Mary's eyes looked tired, but her voice was crisp. She asked after the York children. Elizabeth answered smoothly, with warmth and reassurance, making Mary feel for a moment that someone else could be trusted to hold the family together. Mary nodded once, and in that nod was a kind of grim gratitude. Mary did not love easily, but she respected competence. Elizabeth understood that respect could become alliance. The King's End came in January late evening. The details of those last hours were kept carefully controlled, as such things always were. The official story was simple, dignified. The private truth, as private truths often are, was messier, full of decisions made in whispers, full of human hands trying to manage the unmanageable. Elizabeth did not wail. She did not collapse. She sat with Albert, her hand on his arm, her face pale and calm. When someone came to tell them, Albert's mouth opened and nothing came out at first. His stammer, usually triggered by speeches and pressure, appeared now because grief had tightened his throat. He made a sound, half-breath, half-broken word, and Elizabeth tightened her grip on him as if she could hold him together by force. Edward, in the next room, became king in the moment his father stopped breathing. There was no trumpet for it, no ceremony, just a weight placed on his shoulders while he was still a son in mourning. He reacted the way Edward reacted to most heavy things. He tried to shrug it off. He tried to make it feel like something that would fit if he adjusted it. He did not yet seem to grasp that you do not adjust the crown. The crown adjusts you. The next days were a blur of black clothes and protocol. The royal household moved like a machine. Announcements were made. Flags shifted. Bells rang. The nation began its collective mourning. Queen Mary walked through it with her head high, her face set, as if she could command death to behave properly. Elizabeth was almost startlingly effective in those first public moments. She knew what the country needed to see: unity, dignity, steadiness. She knew when to look sad and when to look composed. She knew how to support Albert without making him look weak. She held herself with the grace of a woman who had been trained all her life for a role she was not supposed to need. And then she went home and shut the door and told Albert quietly that everything had changed. Albert did not argue. He did not have the energy. He sat in a chair, stared at the floor, and said in a small, exhausted voice that Edward would be fine. Elizabeth did not say what she was thinking, which was that Edward was never fine. Edward was charming, he was popular, he was thrilling. Fine was not a word anyone sensible used for Edward. Instead, she kissed Albert's forehead, told him to rest, and began making arrangements in her mind, the way a woman does when she senses the household is about to face a storm. King Edward VIII's accession was public spectacle, layered over private tension. There were councils and proclamations and the solemn traditions that turned a man into a symbol. Edward wore the role well at first, because the role offered him attention, and Edward loved attention the way other people love air. Crowds cheered him. Newspapers praised his modern energy. He looked on the surface like a fresh start. Then almost immediately he began doing things that made the palace staff exchange looks. He was impatient with the old rituals. He disliked long ceremonies. He disliked being told what to do. He brought his own preferences into spaces that were not meant to hold preferences. He changed schedules, dismissed advice, and treated courtiers as if they were employees in a club he owned, rather than guardians of a structure that had existed for centuries. Queen Mary was horrified. She had spent her life preserving the monarchy's shape, and now her son was poking it as if it were a toy. She tried to correct him, of course. Mary always tried to correct. But Edward did not react to correction with obedience. He reacted with resentment. Elizabeth watched Mary and Edward collide and understood something important. Mary's authority had been built on tradition. Edward did not care about tradition. If someone was going to influence Edward, it would not be his mother. It would be someone he chose to listen to. Wallis Simpson. The palace still tried to treat Wallis as a social inconvenience that could be managed. They hoped Edward's interest would fade. They hoped the weight of kingship would sober him. They hoped he would grow bored and move on to a suitable bride. Hope is a lovely thing for ordinary people. In royal households, it is a dangerous drug. Edward did not move on. He moved closer. He began to insist on her presence in his private world. He invited her to gatherings that were not meant to include her. He brought her into circles that would inevitably leak. He looked at her with an attachment that made his friends uneasy, because it did not look like casual desire. It looked like dependence. Wallis, for her part, carried herself with that quick, sharp confidence that made people either adore her or despise her. She was not deferential. She did not soften her opinions. She did not behave like a woman overwhelmed by royal attention. She behaved like a woman who had already decided she would not be frightened. Elizabeth met her again in that new context and felt something close to fury behind her smile, because now Wallis was not merely Edward's amusing friend. She was a shadow over the throne. There is a particular kind of rage that rises in a woman who has followed the rules and watched another woman break them and be rewarded. Elizabeth had followed the rules mostly. She had molded herself into the shape the institution wanted. She had swallowed indignities. She had smiled through boredom. She had pushed her husband to meet expectations. She had taken the monarchy seriously. And now this American woman, divorced, married again, with no interest in pretending she was grateful, was sitting close to the king like a prize. Elizabeth did not confront Wallis. She was too smart for that. A direct fight would make Wallis seem important. Elizabeth's weapon was not shouting. It was exclusion. She could make a room feel chilly without raising her voice. She could greet someone warmly and still leave them feeling unwanted. She could smile at Wallis and then turn mid-sentence to speak to someone else, as if Wallis had been a brief interruption. If Wallis tried to charm her, Elizabeth answered with politeness so perfect it became a wall. Behind the scenes, Elizabeth also began to cultivate sympathy for her position. She spoke to friends gently about duty. She spoke to courtiers about the importance of stability. She spoke to Queen Mary with careful respect, letting Mary feel that Elizabeth shared her alarm. Mary did not trust easily, but she did not have many options. The old guard needed allies, and Elizabeth, with her popularity and her domestic image, was a very useful ally. Albert became the quiet center of that alliance, whether he wanted to or not. Because the more Edward behaved unpredictably, the more people looked to Albert as the safe alternative, the man who would never make the crown look foolish. Albert hated that attention. He did not want to be anyone's alternative. He wanted to be left alone to do his duties and raise his daughters and manage his stammer and keep his life small enough to survive. But the crown does not ask what you want. The crown watches what you can do. Elizabeth pushed Albert into visibility with a tenderness that was not entirely gentle. She encouraged him to accept assignments. She made him practice speeches for events that suddenly felt more significant. She insisted he appear solid, dependable, calm. When he faltered, she tightened her jaw and reminded him he had to do better. When he succeeded, she praised him with the bright pride of a woman polishing her favorite possession. She also began to speak cautiously to Albert about their daughters. This was not just about Edward's scandal. It was about the line of succession. If Edward did not marry properly, if he did not have children, the future of the monarchy would fall to Albert, and then to little Elizabeth. The thought sat in the room between them like an object neither wanted to touch. Albert said quietly that he did not want that life for their child. Elizabeth said quietly that their child might not get a choice. Then she softened and said they would do their best, which sounded kind, It also sounded like a vow. Meanwhile, Edward's behaviour as king grew more unsettling to those around him. He wanted to act like a modern leader, impatient with old constraints, eager to speak directly to people, eager to visit poor areas and talk about suffering. Some of his instincts were genuinely compassionate. He could be moved by hardship, and he could be outraged by inequality. But outrage is not governance, and compassion in a king becomes dangerous if it turns into impulsive promises or public criticism of the very government the crown is meant to support. He met with ministers and seemed bored. He ignored briefings. He complained about paperwork. He wanted things simpler, faster, more personal. The monarchy was not meant to be personal. The monarchy was meant to be a structure people could rely on precisely because it did not behave like an individual. Elizabeth understood that, and it irritated her that Edward did not. It irritated her because she had worked hard to become the kind of royal who made the institution look stable. Edward was making it look unpredictable, and unpredictability makes people nervous. When Edward began to talk, even privately, about marriage, the palace stiffened. The king's marriage was not simply a love story. It was a state matter. It required acceptance by the government and by the Church of England, of which the monarch was the supreme governor. Wallis was still married, and she had a living ex-husband. That fact alone was enough to ignite disaster in the old world the monarchy still depended on. Elizabeth did not need to know every clause to understand the consequence. If Edward insisted on Wallis, it could become a crisis that would split the country and make the crown look ridiculous. It could also force decisions no one wanted to make. Queen Mary spoke to Edward with increasing severity. Edward reacted with increasing stubbornness. He hated being managed, and now he was king, which made him feel he could finally do whatever he pleased. He did not seem to grasp that being king meant you belonged to the country, not to yourself. Wallis became a constant presence in gossip, even when the newspapers were still cautious. People in society whispered. Foreign diplomats noticed. Politicians watched. The palace staff, who heard everything and saw more than anyone suspected, began to treat Wallis like a storm cloud. They did not speak her name loudly. They did not need to. Everyone knew which name was hanging in the air. Elizabeth's feelings about Wallis hardened into something sharper than dislike. It became personal contempt, not just for Wallis, but for Edward's weakness in her presence. Elizabeth believed a man should be strong. She believed he should be steady. She believed he should control himself. Edward was surrendering himself, and Elizabeth found surrender distasteful, unless it was surrender to duty. There were moments when her spite flared in tiny ways, the sort of ways polite people use to cut each other without blood. At a gathering where Wallis was present, Elizabeth might speak to everyone else and leave Wallis as a gap in the conversation. She might praise someone's loyalty to tradition while looking directly at Wallis as she said it. She might laugh at a joke about American manners and let the laughter carry a little longer than necessary. Wallis, sharp as she was, noticed. She was not a woman who enjoyed being dismissed. She responded with her own kind of sharpness, her own refusal to be embarrassed. She would smile back, eyes bright, as if she found Elizabeth's games amusing. The tension between them became one of those social dramas people could feel without ever hearing a raised voice. Two women, both used to control, both convinced they understood the stakes, both determined not to blink first. Albert, caught between them and his brother, grew more miserable. He loved Edward, but he also feared what Edward was doing. He could not bear conflict. He also could not bear the thought of the monarchy collapsing into scandal. He began to withdraw, to spend more time with his children, to bury himself in paperwork, to practice his speeches, as if speaking clearly could somehow stabilize the world. Elizabeth did not let him withdraw entirely. She needed him visible. She needed him ready. She needed him, whether he liked it or not, to look like the man the country could trust if the king became an embarrassment. She also needed to manage her own image with even greater care. She could not appear ambitious. She could not appear eager. She could not appear as if she were waiting for Edward to fail. So she did what she did best. She performed sympathy. When Edward's name came up, she spoke of him warmly in public, calling him devoted, calling him earnest, calling him caring. She praised his connection with the people. She smiled as if the family was united and strong. Privately, she tightened her circle and shared her real thoughts only with those she trusted. Queen Mary became one of those people in a strange way. Mary did not like being comforted, but Mary did like being understood. Elizabeth, with her careful empathy and her shared outrage, made Mary feel less alone in her alarm. Their alliance was not affectionate. It was practical. Mary had authority and tradition. Elizabeth had popularity and warmth. Together they could represent what Edward was threatening to undo. Edward sensed that alliance, and it irritated him. He had always enjoyed being the adored star. Now he felt judged by his mother and his brother's wife, and he disliked it. He began to speak of them as old-fashioned, stiff, unfair. He began to treat their concern as meddling. In Edward's mind, love should be free, and anyone who opposed it was cruel. Elizabeth did not care what Edward called her. She cared what he was doing to the crown. The public still adored Edward at first. They saw the handsome king, the modern face, the man who seemed to notice ordinary people. But affection can turn quickly when it feels betrayed. The monarchy depended on a certain kind of trust, and trust erodes when a leader appears to put personal desire above public responsibility. Elizabeth understood that erosion as if she could feel it in the air. It made her more determined, and also more anxious. She began to imagine the unthinkable. She began to imagine Edward refusing to change. She began to imagine the government forced into open conflict with the king. She began to imagine the monarchy facing a choice that would divide the country. In those imaginations, Elizabeth's own place shifted. She did not admit it, but the possibility of being pulled forward began to look less like a distant nightmare and more like a looming reality. One evening, after the children were asleep, Elizabeth sat with Albert in a quiet room at Royal Lodge. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Albert looked tired in a way that was deeper than exhaustion. It was the tiredness of a man who feels the ground moving under his feet. Elizabeth spoke gently at first. She said Edward was under pressure. She said Edward was stubborn. She said the situation might resolve if Edward were wise. Albert nodded, as if he wanted to believe it. Then Elizabeth leaned forward, her voice low, and said that wisdom was not Edward's habit. She said that if Edward forced a confrontation, the family would have to choose the monarchy over the man. She said that if Edward broke the crown's relationship with the country, someone else would have to repair it. Albert's face tightened. He whispered that he could not. Elizabeth reached across and took his hand. Her grip was firm, almost commanding. She said he could, and he would, because he had no choice. She told him that he was not like Edward. He was not selfish. He was not reckless. He cared. That care, she said, was exactly what the country needed. Albert stared at her, and for a moment his eyes looked frightened, like a child being told he must suddenly become an adult. Elizabeth smiled at him, warm and encouraging, the devoted wife. Then her smile faded, and her voice turned sharper, more real. She said, "Promise me you will not fail." Albert swallowed. His stammer hovered, then he forced the words out slowly. He promised. Elizabeth leaned back, satisfied in a way she did not show too clearly. She had secured what she wanted. Not the crown, not yet, but something just as important. Albert's commitment to stand up when the moment came. In the weeks that followed, Edward continued to push boundaries. He wanted to bring Wallis into official life. He wanted her beside him openly. He wanted the country to accept her because he loved her. Those around him tried to explain again and again that love was not the only issue. The issue was legitimacy, tradition, public trust. Edward heard those words and grew angry because he heard them as personal attack. Wallis, watching all of this, sometimes seemed uneasy. There were moments when she looked like a woman realizing the game had become dangerous. But she was also a woman who had survived social storms before. She had a toughness that made her refuse to retreat easily. Elizabeth watched Wallis's toughness and felt her contempt deepen. In Elizabeth's mind, a decent woman would step away for the good of the country. A decent woman would not allow a king to risk everything. Elizabeth did not consider that Wallis might see herself differently, as a woman finally valued, finally chosen, finally powerful. Elizabeth did not have much patience for other women's stories unless those stories supported her own. And so the tension built, not with one dramatic explosion, but with the steady accumulation of small acts, private conversations, shifting loyalties, and widening fear. The palace, that old creature of tradition, began to behave like a nervous animal. Courtiers whispered more urgently. Politicians visited more often. Queen Mary's face grew harder. Albert's shoulders grew tighter. Elizabeth's smile became brighter in public and colder in private. The future was no longer at the door. It was inside the house, moving from room to room, touching objects, testing locks, making everyone wonder which piece of their life it would pick up and smash first. The air changed first in drawing rooms, not newspapers. It changed in the way people stopped laughing quite so freely when the king's name came up, in the way hosts began seating guests with a little more care, as if a reckless tongue might set the curtains on fire. Because the country did not yet know. Officially, nothing was wrong. The British press still behaved like a polite butler who has seen far too much and intends to die with his dignity intact. Editors and proprietors understood the unwritten bargain. The monarchy offered stability and spectacle, and in return the newspapers did not print what would make the crown look like a tavern story. So the affair stayed largely off British front pages, even as it became the most talked-about secret in Europe. Foreign papers were less respectful, and Americans were downright cheerful about it. In London, those stories arrived like contraband, passed hand to hand at breakfast tables. People would glance at the headline, glance around the room, then fold the paper with a guilty thrill. The king and a married American woman, the sort of sentence that could make a society hostess drop her spoon. Elizabeth heard those whispers everywhere, at lunches, at charity events, at palace receptions where everyone smiled and pretended the monarchy was as solid as stone. She never stopped smiling either. She was too disciplined for that. But anyone who knew her well could see the tightness in her jaw. She was angry in the way only a woman who believes in the rules can be angry, a righteous anger that makes cruelty feel like virtue. Edward moved through those months as if daring the world to stop him. He insisted on taking Wallis with him in ways that made officials blanch. He wanted her close, visible, treated as if she were already something more than a guest who should not be there. He did not understand, or refused to understand, that a king's private life is never truly private. His love affair was not simply romantic, it was constitutional kindling. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin was a practical man with a tired face, the sort of man who looked as if he had been forced to mop up other people's messes for decades. He did not enjoy drama. He also did not enjoy kings who behaved like spoiled sons. Baldwin understood the rules. The monarch was meant to be a neutral symbol, above politics, above scandal. If Edward insisted on marrying Wallis, Baldwin could not simply shrug and hope for the best. The government would have to respond, and the response would not be gentle. Elizabeth did not meet Baldwin often in those months, not directly, not in a way that could be interpreted as meddling. She was careful. But she watched everything that came through Albert's office, and Albert saw more than he wanted to. Reports, briefings, murmurs from private secretaries, all of it adding up to one grim truth. The king was heading toward a cliff with his eyes wide open. Albert would read a memo, rub his forehead, and sit silently for a long moment. Elizabeth would sit nearby, outwardly calm, inwardly humming with an energy she tried not to show. She hated Edward for forcing this crisis on them. She hated him for humiliating the family. She also, in some private corner of her mind, felt the unmistakable pull of opportunity. Not opportunity in the vulgar sense, not money. Elizabeth's tastes already assumed money. This was something deeper. It was the chance to be central, to be the woman the country needed, to be finally, unarguably important. It is possible to be horrified by a scandal and still feel a thrill at what the scandal might give you. Elizabeth contained multitudes. She could love the monarchy and resent it. She could feel dutiful and spiteful in the same breath. She could genuinely fear the country losing faith, and still imagine, with a quiet hunger, how she might restore that faith herself. At home she became sharper with the staff. There were more corrections, more icy looks, more brisk demands for quiet. She wanted her household, running like a clock because the rest of the family was wobbling, and Elizabeth did not tolerate wobbling. If a footman was slow, she noticed. If a maid made an error, she remembered. People walked more carefully around her, as if the carpets might bite. Albert noticed too, and it made him tense. He had always been kind to staff in that awkward, apologetic way of his. Elizabeth's coolness embarrassed him. He would sometimes murmur to her that she was being hard. Elizabeth would answer lightly that standards mattered, especially now. She said it as if she were talking about table settings, not human beings. Then she would soften, because she knew when she had pushed too far. She would be charming at dinner, ask after a servant's family, offer a smile that made the servant flush with relief. That was Elizabeth's pattern. She could wound and then soothe, leaving people grateful for the soothing and afraid of the wound. The children felt the tension in ways adults often underestimate. Little Elizabeth, serious and observant, began asking questions in that careful voice children use when they sense danger. She asked why everyone looked tired. She asked why people were whispering. Elizabeth, her mother, answered with gentle firmness, saying grown-up matters were complicated and that her daughter must not worry. But the child worried anyway because children are not fooled by polite lies. They read faces. They read silences. Margaret, younger and more emotional, reacted differently. She grew clingier, more likely to sulk, more likely to demand attention at the worst moments. Elizabeth could be affectionate with her, but she could also be impatient. She did not enjoy being needed in a messy, noisy way. She enjoyed being needed in a dignified way. A sobbing child was not dignified. One afternoon, Margaret had a small tantrum over something trivial, a toy, a ribbon, a childish frustration. Elizabeth snapped. Not loudly, not in a way that would be repeated in gossip, but sharply enough that the room chilled. Margaret froze, startled, then burst into tears. Elizabeth stared for a moment, then gathered herself and went to her daughter, smoothing the child's hair with brisk tenderness. "You must not make scenes," she said softly. It was a strange lesson to give a child, and also a perfect one for a princess. The feeling is less important than the appearance. Margaret sniffled and nodded. Little Elizabeth watched silently from the corner, storing the moment away like a coin. In the palace, the crisis tightened. Wallis began divorce proceedings from her husband, Ernest Simpson. Divorce in their world was not just a private heartbreak. It was a social stain, and in royal terms it was a wall. A divorced woman with a living former husband could not be the queen, not without tearing at the church, the government, and the public sense of moral order. Edward did not care, or he cared and did it anyway. He told people he could not live without her, a phrase that always sounds romantic until you realize how childish it is when spoken by a king. He spoke of sacrifice, as if the only sacrifice that mattered was his own. He did not speak much about the sacrifice demanded of the institution, of the country, of everyone forced to live with the consequences of his love story. Elizabeth found that selfishness unforgivable, because Elizabeth, whatever else she was, understood duty. She understood sacrifice too, at least the kind she recognized. She believed she had sacrificed her freedom, her privacy, her ease to live inside the monarchy. She believed she had done her part. Edward was refusing his part, and he expected sympathy for it. Her contempt for him deepened, and contempt makes people cruel. At family gatherings, she became colder toward Edward, though she kept it wrapped in manners. She would greet him politely, then spend her warmth on others. She would speak of duty as if it were the most natural thing in the world, then glance at Edward with eyes that said, "Some of us actually do it." Edward, sensitive to judgment, reacted with irritation. He accused his family of being stiff, unfeeling, old-fashioned. Elizabeth heard those accusations and smiled as if they amused her. Inside, she sharpened her resolve. Queen Mary's fury toward Wallis became almost puritanical. Mary saw Wallis not just as a social problem, but as a moral infection. She spoke of her with disgust. Elizabeth agreed publicly, and privately she took the disgust and made it practical. Mary's outrage could be channeled. Mary's authority could be used. The two women, so different in temperament, moved closer in purpose. Mary was tradition. Elizabeth was popularity. Together they could represent the monarchy's best face, the face Edward was threatening to smear. Albert was pulled into meetings with officials more often. He sat with his private secretary, with advisers, with people who looked grave and spoke carefully. He was briefed on possibilities he did not want to consider. What if the king insisted? What if the government resigned? What if the public turned? What if the king refused to back down? What if? Albert would come home pale and exhausted. Elizabeth would greet him with a smile that tried to feel normal. Then, when they were alone, she would question him. Not aggressively, not obviously. She was too clever for that. She would ask what Baldwin had said. She would ask what the Archbishop thought. She would ask what the mood was among ministers. She would listen, eyes bright, absorbing every detail. Albert sometimes accused her, gently, of being too interested. Elizabeth would look wounded, as if he had insulted her heart. She would say she was only concerned for the country, for the family, for their children. She would say she wished none of it were happening. She would say she wanted peace. And she did want peace, but she wanted it on her terms. One evening Albert tried to set boundaries. He told her he could not bear constant talk about Edward. He told her it made him miserable. Elizabeth listened, then reached across the table and touched his hand. Her voice softened. "My darling, I know," she said. "But if we do not face it, it will face us." Albert looked at her, trapped by her logic and her tenderness. He nodded, because he always nodded when she cornered him with reason and affection at once. By late autumn the crisis was no longer containable. The foreign press was full of it. Diplomats were aware, ministers were anxious, British newspapers still. Held back, but silence cannot last when the whole world is shouting. Rumors seeped into the public like damp. People began to sense something was wrong, even if they did not know what. They could feel the tension in the air, the way you can feel thunder before it arrives. Edward, desperate to control the story, began to talk about making a broadcast to the nation. He wanted to explain himself, to appeal directly to the public, to frame the situation as a love story being cruelly obstructed by cold officials. It was a dangerous idea. A king was not supposed to argue his case like a man begging for applause. The very act would change the monarchy's relationship with the government and the people. Baldwin opposed it. Ministers opposed it. Courtiers panicked. The palace became a nest of low voices and urgent footsteps. Elizabeth heard about the broadcast idea and felt her stomach twist. If Edward went on the radio and turned the crisis into a public emotional spectacle, it could split the country. People might support him out of sympathy, out of romance, out of a stubborn dislike of politicians. Others would be outraged. The monarchy would become a battleground, and Elizabeth had no appetite for the monarchy as a battleground. She wanted it adored, not debated. She also knew something else. If Edward made the crisis public in a messy way, he might force the government's hand faster. And that could accelerate the one outcome she was quietly preparing for. In early December, British newspapers finally began to print careful references, cautious phrases that hinted at the storm without naming it fully. Once the silence cracked, the story rushed in. People who had never heard Wallis Simpson's name learned it overnight. They learned she was American. They learned she was married. They learned the king wanted to marry her anyway. They reacted with fascination, shock, delight, disgust, depending on their temperament and their politics. The country loved romance, yes, but it also loved stability. Many ordinary people, struggling through hard years, did not appreciate a king who seemed willing to throw the nation into chaos for his own happiness. Others did, because the idea of a king defying old rules for love was thrilling. The country did not speak with one voice, it never does. Elizabeth watched public reaction with the alertness of a woman who knew her own future might be shaped by it. She read reports. She listened to what people said at events. She paid attention to the mood in crowds. She could sense sympathy for Edward in some places, and irritation in others. She adjusted her own public demeanor accordingly. She was sympathetic without endorsing. She was calm without seeming smug. She was careful not to look like she was benefiting from the crisis. Privately, she benefited from it in the most important way. People began to look at her with a kind of hopeful gratitude. At events, women would catch her eye and smile as if she were the reliable friend in a room full of unreliable men. Men would speak to her with respect that had sharpened into something like trust. She became, quietly, the emotional anchor of the royal family. Elizabeth enjoyed it. She did not need to confess that enjoyment. It showed in the way she held herself, a fraction more certain, a fraction more regal. She had always loved being admired. Now she was being relied upon. Wallis, meanwhile, became the most hated and most discussed woman in Britain. She received threats. She was followed. Her name was said with venom by people who had never met her. She became a symbol for everything the old world feared: modernity, divorce, American bluntness, female ambition. At times, Wallis seemed to want to escape. There were moments when she looked tired, even frightened. She left Britain for a period, partly to avoid the storm, partly to reduce pressure. Some saw it as retreat. Others saw it as manipulation. Elizabeth saw it as proof that Wallis knew exactly how powerful she had become. Edward did not retreat. He grew more stubborn. He told Baldwin he intended to marry Wallis. Baldwin told him the government could not support it. Edward suggested alternatives, including the idea of a marriage where Wallis would not be queen, a so-called morganatic arrangement, a word that sounded like a polite loophole, but in practice was a fantasy in Britain. The government did not accept it. The Church did not accept it. The dominions, the other countries under the Crown's umbrella, had to be consulted, and many of them were appalled. Edward, spoiled by privilege and adored by crowds, struggled to understand why his wishes did not become reality. He had always been able to charm his way out of trouble. This time, charm could not change law, church, and politics. The crown was a jewel, yes, but it was also a web, and Edward had gotten himself tangled. Albert watched his brother flail and felt sick. He loved Edward, and he also saw him becoming something ugly. There is a particular heartbreak in watching someone you love behave selfishly on a grand stage. Albert could not fix it. He could only wait and dread. Elizabeth did not wait passively. She began to behave as if they were already on the edge of a new life. She spoke more often to Albert about logistics, about what would happen if the unimaginable happened. She spoke about the children's education, about their security, about their future. She did it in a tone that suggested she was merely being sensible, but her eyes were too bright for mere sensibility. Albert resisted, weakly. He said Edward would come to his senses. Elizabeth did not contradict him directly. She simply looked at him with that steady gaze and said, "We must be ready if he does not." In those days, she and Queen Mary spoke more frequently. Mary, grieving her husband and furious with her son, felt betrayed. She had raised Edward to be king. She had shaped him with duty and tradition, or she thought she had. Now he was shattering what she had tried to preserve. Her anger was fierce, almost maternal in its wounded pride. Elizabeth listened and offered sympathy, and in doing so she became indispensable to Mary. It was a delicate relationship. Mary did not like being comforted, but she liked being obeyed. Elizabeth offered neither obedience nor open defiance. She offered agreement and support, which allowed Mary to feel she still held the family's moral center. Elizabeth was giving Mary what she needed, and in return she gained something priceless: Mary's approval, or at least Mary's alliance. That alliance mattered because Mary still held weight in the court. Her opinions shaped the old guard. Her disapproval could harden into a kind of institutional rejection. If Mary turned fully against Edward's plan, it strengthened the resistance around him. Elizabeth understood that perfectly. Edward, sensing his mother's opposition and Elizabeth's quiet influence, grew more resentful. He began to speak sharply about his family. He accused them of plotting. He accused them of wanting him to fail. He accused them of coldness. Elizabeth did not care what he accused her of. She cared that he was losing. There was a night near the height of the crisis when Edward visited Albert privately. It was not a cheerful brotherly chat. It was tense, emotional, full of strained affection and sharp edges. Edward spoke about love, about loneliness, about feeling trapped. He spoke as if he were the victim of a cruel system. Albert listened, miserable, trying to be supportive without betraying the institution. He did not have Edward's ease with emotion. He could not argue smoothly. He could not even speak smoothly. His stammer returned, triggered by pressure and heartbreak, and Edward, impatient, looked away in frustration. Elizabeth was not in the room, but she knew every word afterward. Albert told her haltingly, ashamed of his own weakness, ashamed of his brother's stubbornness. Elizabeth listened, then said something that sounded sympathetic and was also lethal. "He is thinking only of himself," she said. Albert tried to defend Edward. He said Edward was under strain. Elizabeth answered that everyone was under strain, and that duty did not disappear because strain was uncomfortable. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Her calm judgment made the condemnation feel final. Then she said softly, almost kindly, "You are not like him, Bertie." Albert looked at her, and for a moment her praise felt like a burden, because if he was not like Edward, then he might be asked to do what Edward would not. The crisis moved quickly after that, as if the country itself had decided it had waited long enough. Baldwin made it clear that the government would resign if Edward married Wallis as Queen. The opposition did not offer support for Edward either. The Archbishop of Canterbury's position was firm. The Dominions were consulted, and their leaders largely opposed the marriage. The constitutional machinery, slow and heavy, began to grind toward one conclusion. Edward could choose the crown or he could choose Wallis. He could not keep both. He did not respond like a man making a sober decision about a nation. He responded like a man being told he could not have his favorite toy. He raged, sulked, argued, pleaded. He considered fighting publicly. He considered forcing Baldwin out. He considered appealing directly to the people. He acted as if he were negotiating, not recognizing that the institution was refusing to negotiate at all. Wallis remained away, watching from a distance, receiving messages, feeling the pressure tighten. Some accounts suggest she urged Edward to reconsider. Others suggest she enjoyed the power. The truth was likely complicated. Wallis was not a simple villain or a simple heroine. She was a woman who had become the center of a storm too large for any one person to control. She may have wanted escape even as she wanted to be chosen. Those desires can exist together. Elizabeth, however, did not offer Wallis complexity in her mind. Elizabeth needed a villain, and Wallis fit beautifully. Wallis was the outsider. Wallis was the divorced American. Wallis was the woman who had bewitched the king and turned him against his duty. That story made sense to people, and it made sense to Elizabeth. It also allowed Elizabeth to keep her contempt clean. She could hate Wallis without having to pity Edward too much. As the days narrowed toward the decision, Elizabeth's household became even more controlled. She hosted fewer frivolous gatherings. She kept her circle tight. She watched her daughters with a kind of fierce protectiveness, as if she could already see the new weight that might fall on their small shoulders. She began to speak to the older child more seriously, though still gently, about responsibility, about listening, about behaving properly. Little Elizabeth absorbed it with that solemn attentiveness that made adults uncomfortable. Albert began to have moments of panic. Late at night he would wake, sweating, convinced he could not do what might be required. Elizabeth would soothe him, then push him back into readiness. She would tell him he was strong. She would tell him he was good. She would tell him the country would love him because he was not selfish. She made duty sound like salvation. She also made it clear, without ever saying it openly, that she expected him to do it. She expected him to step up. She expected him to save the monarchy. And she expected, in doing so, to become something she had never said she wanted to be. There is a particular expression Elizabeth wore in those days, often in public, sometimes in private. It was a smile that looked kind and composed, but it held a quiet steel. It was the expression of a woman who has decided she will survive whatever comes, and that others will adjust around her survival. In the final days before the decision, Edward retreated to Fort Belvedere, a house tucked into Windsor Great Park, a place that felt both royal and secluded. It became the center of the drama, with officials coming and going, messages flying, the atmosphere thick with history being made by exhausted men in suits. Albert and Elizabeth remained at Royal Lodge, close enough to be summoned, close enough to feel the tremors. They received updates that were carefully phrased. They were told to be prepared. Prepared for what was not yet said aloud, because saying it aloud felt like conjuring it. One evening, a messenger arrived with a note, and Albert's hands shook as he read it. He looked up at Elizabeth, his face pale. "He is considering it," Albert whispered. Elizabeth did not ask what. She knew. She nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting this all along. Albert's voice broke. "If he does it," he said, and he could not finish. Elizabeth stepped close and took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were bright, her expression tender, and underneath it was that unwavering demand. "If he does it," she said softly, "you will not fail." Albert swallowed, trapped by love, duty, and the quiet force of the woman in front of him. He nodded, because he could not do anything else. Outside, the winter night pressed against the windows. The country slept, most people still not fully understanding the scale of what was unfolding. In the secluded royal houses, lights stayed on. Men wrote and rewrote documents. Phones rang, voices murmured. A king paced, torn between desire and duty, still surprised that duty would not move aside. And in another house nearby, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon stood very still beside her husband, and if you looked closely, you could see that she was frightened, yes, and furious, yes, but also strangely, unmistakably ready. The next morning the servants moved as if the floors were made of thin ice. Even the teacups seemed quieter. Someone had finally said the word everyone had been avoiding, and once a word is spoken, it changes the air. Edward was still at Fort Belvedere, still pacing, still insisting he could not live without Wallace. Ministers and advisers came and went with faces that looked carved from worry. They did not treat him like a romantic hero. They treated him like a fire that had started in the curtains. At Royal Lodge, Albert read every update as if each sentence might bite him. He looked smaller than usual, not physically, but emotionally, as if the room had grown and he had shrunk inside it. Elizabeth kept close to him, not hovering, not fussing, but always there, the way a steady hand rests on the back of a chair. She did not drink too much. She did not chatter. She watched the door. She listened for footsteps. When the final message came, it did not arrive with trumpets. It arrived like a funeral notice. Edward had decided to give up the crown. Albert sat down hard, as if his legs had forgotten their job. For a moment he looked blank, stunned, not relieved, not joyful, just emptied out. Elizabeth's face tightened, then softened into something almost serene. Not because she was happy, not exactly, but because the uncertainty was gone. A crisis, at least, can be managed. Uncertainty is what drives people mad. Albert whispered, "He has done it." Elizabeth nodded. Her voice was very quiet. "He has done it," she repeated, and if you listened closely you could hear the judgment in her tone. Not sorrow for her brother-in-law, not sympathy for a man about to become the most famous quitter in the world. Judgment, clean and cold. The abdication itself was handled like everything royal, with ceremony wrapped around catastrophe. Edward signed the documents. His brothers signed as witnesses. It was meant to look orderly, controlled, almost respectable. But there is no respectable way to watch a king step off his throne because he cannot give up a woman. The next day, Edward spoke to the nation on the radio. The whole country seemed to pause to listen. People gathered around sets in sitting rooms and pubs, leaning forward, breath caught, as if a voice could explain what the mind could not fully accept. Edward said he could not carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved. It was meant to sound noble. To many, it sounded like a man admitting he would not do the job he had been born to do. At Royal Lodge, Albert listened with his head bowed. Elizabeth listened with her face perfectly still. When the broadcast ended, Albert whispered something that sounded like grief, anger, and fear all braided together. "He has done it," he said again, as if repeating it might change it. Elizabeth stood, walked to the window, and stared out at the winter trees. She did not cry. Not then. Her emotions were too busy. Her mind was already moving through the consequences. Edward was gone from the throne. That meant Albert was king, which meant she was queen. It is strange to watch someone become something they have been rehearsing for without admitting it. Elizabeth had always framed her ambition as duty. Now duty had delivered her reward. She did not leap for joy. She did something more impressive and more revealing. She steadied herself as if she had expected this moment all along. Albert's accession happened immediately. There is no pause between one monarch and the next, not even for a breath. The crown does not wait for a man to catch up to his new name. Edward stepped aside and Albert became King George VI, choosing a name that felt like a promise of continuity, a salute to his father, a signal to the country that this would not be a reign of glamour and flirtation. This would be a reign of stability, whether the new king liked it or not. Elizabeth understood the power of that choice. She also understood what it cost Albert. He had not wanted the throne. Now it had him. In the first hours after the abdication, the royal world reassembled itself around the new centre. Courtiers who had been nervous became brisk. Officials who had been cautious became purposeful. People began using new titles as if they had been practicing them in secret. There was a moment, small but telling, when someone addressed Elizabeth as "Your Majesty" for the first time. She answered smoothly, as if she had always been that. But later, alone, she exhaled in a way that sounded like a person setting down a heavy bag they have carried for years without admitting it was heavy. Albert, however, looked as if someone had placed a mountain on his shoulders and told him not to wobble. The first challenge came quickly. The new king had to address the nation, to steady a public shaken by the abdication, to reassure people that the monarchy had not become a farce. Albert's stammer, always lurking, was now a national threat. A king who could not speak clearly in a crisis would be devoured by anxiety and ridicule. Elizabeth turned instantly into a commander. Lionel Logue was summoned. Practice began again, relentless, exhausting, intimate. Albert read texts aloud until his throat hurt. He sweated, cursed, lost patience, then tried again. He was terrified. Elizabeth did not let him collapse into that terror. When he faltered, she corrected him. When he wanted to quit, she insisted. When he succeeded, she praised him with a fierce brightness. This was not the gentle support of a woman merely in love. It was the determined support of a woman who understood that her own future depended on his voice. The first broadcast as king was not flawless, but it was steady enough. Albert spoke slowly. He forced each word out as if pulling it from stone. The nation listened, and many people felt something unexpected. Tenderness. Here was a man who was not a dazzling star. Here was a man who struggled, who worked, who tried. After Edward's dramatic departure, trying felt like heroism. Elizabeth became, instantly, the face beside that heroism. She did not stammer. She did not wobble. She smiled with calm assurance, and people clung to her as if she were the stable surface in a room full of shifting furniture. Edward, meanwhile, was being turned from king into problem. Because abdication did not erase him. It simply changed the nature of the threat. Edward was still a prince, still famous, still adored by some, still stubborn, still convinced he had been wronged. He and Wallis were not going to vanish quietly into private life. They were going to live as symbols of a choice that had shaken the monarchy. Every decision about their titles, their money, their place in royal life mattered, because each decision signaled how the new king and queen would treat betrayal. Elizabeth had no softness for Edward. If anything, her anger sharpened now that his selfishness had become their burden. She blamed him not only for the crisis, but for the pain she saw in Albert's face. She blamed him for the pressure on their children. She blamed him for forcing her into a role she would now have to perform under a harsher light. And Elizabeth, when forced, rarely forgave. The question of Edward's title became a quiet battlefield. He would be known as the Duke of Windsor. That was the public face of it, neat and simple. Behind that neatness was the more poisonous issue: how to treat Wallis. Edward wanted Wallis to be given the style of Her Royal Highness once they married. He believed she deserved it because she was his wife, and because he had once been king. The government and the palace did not agree. There were legal and constitutional points, yes, but the human truth was simpler. If Wallis was treated as fully royal, it would look as if the monarchy had rewarded the woman who had helped bring it to the edge. Elizabeth would not allow that. She did not say it in public, of course. She did not have to. Her feelings were understood in every corridor. Those close to her knew she could be charming to strangers and merciless to enemies. Wallis had become her enemy, whether Wallis had meant to or not. Albert, gentler by nature, was torn. Edward was his brother. He had grown up beside him. He still felt loyalty and guilt and a lingering affection. Elizabeth pressed against that affection like a thumb on a bruise. She reminded Albert quietly of what Edward had done. She reminded him of the humiliation. She reminded him of the burden now on his shoulders. She reminded him, without ever needing to say it plainly, that being too generous would make them look weak. Albert did not like conflict. Elizabeth did not mind it when she believed she was morally right. So the decision came down as it so often did in their marriage. Albert hesitated. Elizabeth held firm. The result favoured her firmness. Wallis would not be styled Her Royal Highness. Edward raged, sulked, threatened. Elizabeth did not care. In her mind, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were a cautionary tale, and cautionary tales do not get crowns. This was the first clear glimpse of Elizabeth's spite in her new role. The public saw a smiling queen consort. The private world saw a woman settling scores. And then there was money. Edward wanted an allowance fitting a king, or at least fitting a man who believed he had been robbed. The new king could not afford to look stingy, but he also could not afford to look foolish. The monarchy was already being watched with skepticism. There were negotiations, statements, agreements. The language was polite, the feelings were not. Elizabeth did not enjoy discussing money, but she enjoyed controlling it. Not because she loved economy, she did not. She loved comfort, but she loved power, and money is a lever. She wanted Edward kept comfortable enough not to become desperate, but not comfortable enough to feel victorious. She wanted him far enough away not to disrupt their reign, but not so far that he could play martyr without consequence. She wanted the story to settle into a moral shape the public could accept. The king who chose duty, and the king who chose love, one steady, one selfish. Edward made it difficult. He left Britain with Wallis, and their exile became a kind of glamorous punishment. They lived in Europe among social circles that adored scandal. They hosted dinners, attended parties, and sometimes behaved as if they were the true royal couple, wronged by an old-fashioned establishment. Their very existence threatened to keep the abdication drama alive. Elizabeth watched this from London and felt her fury harden into something permanent. She did not want Edward remembered as romantic. She wanted him remembered as irresponsible. She did not want Wallis remembered as glamorous. She wanted her remembered as destructive. This desire shaped Elizabeth more than she would admit. It made her vigilant, it made her controlling, it made her, at times, petty. In the palace, she also faced another complicated female presence, Queen Mary. Mary was now the king's mother, still formidable, still steeped in tradition, still convinced she knew best. She did not fade politely into the background. She remained a presence, an authority, a woman who had ruled her household for decades and did not intend to be treated like decorative furniture. Elizabeth, now queen, had to navigate this carefully. She needed Mary's support. The older generation trusted Mary. The court still bowed to her influence. But Elizabeth also did not intend to be managed by her mother-in-law. She had swallowed Mary's corrections as Duchess. As Queen, she wanted to be the one giving corrections. Their relationship became a dance of respect and rivalry. Mary insisted on old forms, old rules, old ways. Elizabeth, who also loved old rules when they benefited her, could agree with Mary often. The difference was that Elizabeth wanted warmth with the rules. She wanted to be loved. Mary had never cared about being loved. She cared about being right. Elizabeth began to assert her own style in the royal household. She made changes to the atmosphere, the hosting, the way rooms felt. She wanted Buckingham Palace to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a living home, at least in appearance. She wanted dinners to feel less stiff. She wanted staff to move with efficiency but also with devotion. She expected loyalty now not just to her husband, but to her. Staff who had served through multiple reigns watched her carefully. Some adored her, some feared her. Many did both. Elizabeth could be generous with praise and also quick to punish. She could reward a servant with a smile that felt like sunlight. She could freeze a servant with a glance that felt like winter. She also, now that she was queen, allowed herself even more indulgence in style. Clothes mattered more than ever because she was now the image of the monarchy beside the king. She needed to look regal, steady, unshakable. That was her justification. She did not say, "I enjoy beautiful things." She said, "It is important for the country." The spending continued. Those around her did not always dare to mention it, but it was noticed. Elizabeth wanted the best fabrics, the best hats, the best jewels, the best flowers, the best dinners. She wanted everything done properly, and properly always seemed to cost more. The monarchy had emerged from the abdication battered. Elizabeth's answer was to polish it until it shone. Some would call that courage. Others would call it denial. Elizabeth would call it duty. The coronation had already been planned for Edward. Now it would be George VI and Queen Elizabeth crowned in his place. The date was set for May 1937. The planning became a national project full of symbolism. It had to reassure the country that the monarchy had not fractured. It had to present the new king as legitimate and strong. It had to make people forget, or at least forgive, the fact that the previous king had run off to marry a divorced American. Elizabeth understood the importance of spectacle. She had always understood it. She threw herself into the coronation preparation with the energy of a woman who knew she was being watched by history. Albert, anxious, dreaded the public speaking. He dreaded the ceremony itself, the wait, the crowds, the eyes. Elizabeth soothed him and pushed him in equal measure. She told him he would be fine. She told him he must be fine. She told him he was the right man because he would not embarrass the crown. She framed his fear as virtue, as humility, as proof of seriousness. She did not allow him the comfort of escape. Their daughters were drawn into this new reality in ways that would shape them, forever. Little Elizabeth, now the heir presumptive, was suddenly treated differently. People spoke around her more carefully. Tutors were chosen with greater urgency. Her mother began to watch her with a sharper gaze, as if searching for strength. The child responded with obedience because that was her nature. She learned to hold her face still. She learned to speak properly. She learned that her feelings belonged behind her eyes. She learned, in other words, to be royal. Margaret, meanwhile, became the family's bright distraction. She could make people laugh. She could dance around the room, demand attention, and then charm her way back into favor. Elizabeth indulged her more than she should have, partly because Margaret's sparkle delighted her, and partly because Margaret's mischief made the household feel less heavy. Margaret was the reminder that life could still be playful, but indulgence comes with a price. Margaret learned early that charm could smooth over trouble because she had seen her mother do it. She also learned that being loved can become a way of getting what you want. Elizabeth was teaching her daughters different lessons, not intentionally, but through the atmosphere she created. As Coronation Day approached, the family's public life became a procession of rehearsed calm. Elizabeth perfected her smile. Albert practiced his speeches until he could barely bear the sound of his own voice. The palace staff moved like dancers, each step planned, each detail polished. And through it all, Edward and Wallis hung over everything like a whispered name. There were arguments over whether Edward should attend the coronation. Some believed he should, to show unity, to make the transition look peaceful. Others believed his presence would turn the coronation into a sideshow. The thought of Edward sitting there watching his brother crowned made people uncomfortable in a way they struggled to admit. Elizabeth did not want him there. She did not say it in a tantrum. She did not need to. Her eyes said it. Her stillness said it. She did not want that man, the man who had thrown their family into turmoil, anywhere near the moment meant to heal it. Edward, insulted, stayed away. Whether by choice, by pressure, or by mutual coldness, the result was the same. He was not there when his brother placed the crown on his own head and accepted the burden Edward had discarded. The coronation itself was a blur of tradition and spectacle. Westminster Abbey, ancient and heavy with history, the coronation chair, worn by centuries, the sacred oil, the oaths, the music, the procession. The country watched, hungry for reassurance. They wanted to believe the monarchy was solid again. George VI managed the ceremony with visible strain and admirable determination. He did not glide like Edward would have. He endured. He did not charm. He persisted. And in that persistence, people found something comforting. Elizabeth looked radiant, composed, the picture of royal dignity. She understood what people needed to see. They needed to see a queen who looked like she belonged there, a woman who could hold the public's affection. While her husband held the crown's authority, she gave them that. Afterward, at Buckingham Palace, the balcony appearance, the cheering crowds, the waving, the national sigh of relief, all of it felt like the monarchy inhaling after nearly drowning. Elizabeth waved with that effortless warmth that made people feel personally noticed. She smiled as if she were grateful. She also smiled as if she knew she had won. Because she had, in a way. Not against Edward, though she would have enjoyed framing it like that. She had won against chaos. She had won against uncertainty. She had won the role she had been inching toward for years. She had become queen, and the country had accepted her. The acceptance fed something in her. It made her bolder in private. It made her more convinced of her own judgment. It made her less tolerant of anyone who threatened the new stability she had helped create. Edward from abroad did not let the story settle easily. He wrote letters, complained, demanded. He resented the limitations placed on Wallis. He resented the financial arrangements. He resented the fact that the family, and especially Elizabeth, treated him like a stain they were scrubbing out of the carpet. Elizabeth treated him exactly like that. She did not want him close. She did not want him heard. She did not want him invited into the family's warmth, because warmth makes people forgiven, and Elizabeth did not want him forgiven. This was where her spite became almost an identity. She could not move forward without dragging Edward's betrayal behind her like a shadow. She spoke of him rarely in public, but privately she referred to him with a kind of contempt that surprised even those who agreed with her. She could be almost gleeful in her coldness, as if cruelty were a form of moral cleanliness. Albert sometimes tried to soften her. He would say, quietly, that Edward was still his brother. Elizabeth would answer, quietly, that Edward had not behaved like a brother. Then she would remind Albert, with a sweet tone that was anything but sweet, how much pain Edward had caused. Albert would fall silent, because he could not argue with pain. In this way, Elizabeth held not only the household, but also her husband's emotions. She allowed him affection when it suited the stability of their reign. She denied him affection when it threatened that stability. She shaped the family's memory of Edward, and memory is power. As the months passed, the new reign settled into routine. Public duties, state occasions, visits, speeches. Elizabeth became the monarchy's emotional face. George VI became its steady voice, carefully trained, slowly improving, always working. But the world beyond Britain did not pause to admire their coronation. Europe was growing darker. Politics grew harsher. The mood shifted. There were men in uniforms making speeches full of menace. There were invasions and threats. There was a sense, spreading slowly at first and then faster, that another war was creeping closer. Elizabeth felt that shift too, and it disturbed her in a way that was almost physical. Not because she feared discomfort for herself, though she did not enjoy discomfort. She feared what war would demand of the monarchy. The last war had nearly broken Europe. Another war could break the world they lived in, the world of palaces and crowns and traditions. It could also, she knew, break people's patience for symbols. In war, people want leaders who share risk. They do not want leaders hiding behind curtains. Elizabeth began to prepare for that reality, the way she prepared for everything, with control, with performance, with determination to make the monarchy look necessary. She studied crowds more closely. She listened to the tone of public conversation. She watched how people reacted to the king's speeches, to her own appearances. She understood that the monarchy's survival would depend on being seen, not just admired. It would depend on being present in hardship, not just in celebration. She also understood, perhaps more clearly than her husband, that the story of Edward and Wallace could return at the worst possible time. If war came, any hint of division, any glamorous alternative royal couple drifting around Europe could become dangerous gossip or worse. Elizabeth did not only dislike Edward now, she feared what his existence might mean in a world sliding toward conflict. One night, after a long day, she stood in a palace corridor and listened to the distant hum of voices, advisers discussing foreign news, ministers coming and going with tense faces. She felt the weight of her new title settle into her bones. She had wanted to be central, and now she was. She had wanted to protect the crown, and now the crown was facing something larger than any family scandal. She went into her husband's room and found him reading papers, his face tired, his eyes strained. He looked up at her with that familiar mixture of love and worry. Elizabeth sat beside him, took his hand, and spoke with the same quiet firmness she had used when Edward's abdication was still only a fear. "We will not run," she said. Albert stared at her, understanding more than she had said. He nodded slowly because he trusted her. He also nodded because he did not know how to be anything but dutiful. Elizabeth squeezed his hand, her smile small and controlled. In that moment, she was not the bright hostess or the polished queen. She was the woman underneath, stubborn, proud, easily offended, fiercely protective of her own place, and willing to harden herself into steel if the world demanded it. Outside the palace windows, London continued to glow at night. Busy streets, theatres, dinners, laughter, as if life could stay normal by sheer habit. But beyond the city, beyond the sea, the world was rearranging itself into something crueler, and the monarchy, newly patched together after a love scandal, was about to be tested in a way no coronation could disguise. By the time war finally said its name out loud, the palace had already been living with it for years, the way a family lives with a bad smell in the house. Windows opened, flowers arranged, everyone insisting it is nothing. In September 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, there was a moment when the royal household looked around as if expecting someone to tell them where to stand. The ministers had their plans, the generals had theirs, and the public had only one question that mattered in the first days: would the king and queen run? Elizabeth understood that question before anyone asked it. She also understood the answer she wanted the world to see. She had built her entire public self on steadiness, and now steadiness had to be more than a pretty idea. It had to be a decision. People urged evacuation. People suggested Canada. People spoke of safety with the anxious kindness used for fragile objects. Elizabeth listened, smiling, and then said the words that would become her line in the sand. "The children will not go without me. I will not go without the king, and the king will never go." There was stubborn pride in it, and there was calculation. She knew that if she stayed in London, she would be adored. She knew that danger shared becomes loyalty. She also knew that a queen who fled would be remembered as a coward forever. Elizabeth could accept many things, but she could not accept being remembered as lesser. Albert, now George VI, did not want to leave either. His sense of duty was sincere, and it was also bound up in his terror of looking weak. He had been the reluctant substitute for his brother. He could not afford another public doubt. Staying was not only brave, it was necessary. So they stayed. The girls, Elizabeth and Margaret, were moved for safety, mostly to Windsor, which became their controlled little world of lessons and routines, a childhood hemmed in by war. Their parents visited, kissed them, reassured them, then returned to London because the performance of courage demanded it. Elizabeth did not talk much about what it cost to leave her children behind. She did not allow herself the indulgence of visible fear. She turned fear into crisp schedules and decisive smiles. When the first air raids began to gnaw at London, Elizabeth learned the sound of sirens like a new kind of etiquette. There were procedures, shelters, blackout curtains, staff trained to move quickly. Buckingham Palace, with all its grandeur, became a place where windows were taped and corridors smelled faintly of damp stone and unease. Elizabeth insisted that the royal household keep up appearances. Clothes were pressed, dinners were served properly. Staff were expected to behave as if the world outside was not collapsing into smoke. To some it looked like courage. To others, it looked like stubborn privilege refusing to admit the rules had changed. Then, in September 1940, bombs hit Buckingham Palace. The palace had always been a symbol, a building people could point to and say, that is where they live. When it was hit, it was as if the war had reached into the crown itself. There was damage, broken glass, cracked stone, the smell of smoke in rooms built for ceremony. Elizabeth was in the palace when it was bombed, and she reacted with a steadiness that was both impressive and revealing. She did not faint. She did not scream. She looked at the damage, lifted her chin, and later said a line that travelled through London like a talisman. She was glad the palace had been bombed. Now she could look the East End in the face. It was brilliant, and it was sharp. It turned danger into solidarity. It made her sound like someone who understood suffering. It also made it clear that she cared deeply about appearances, even in tragedy. She did not say she was glad people might have died. She said she was glad the symbol had been wounded, because now she could meet the wounded without shame. Shame, for Elizabeth, was always social first, emotional second. After that, her visits to bomb sites became a kind of wartime ritual. She arrived in carefully chosen outfits, practical enough to look serious, polished enough to look royal. She spoke to families standing in rubble, her voice warm, her eyes bright, her hands offered in sympathy. People cried when they met her. People smiled through tears. She was good at this, not because she was pretending, but because she knew how to make someone feel seen. And yet, there were moments when her spoiled side peeked through, even in war. If a schedule ran late, she could become brisk. If a room was too cold, she complained. If someone fussed over her safety too much, she snapped. Not because she was fearless, but because she hated being managed. She turned danger into a stage, and she performed courage so consistently that the country began to believe it was her natural state. That belief became. Winston Churchill, now Prime Minister, understood the value of that armour. Churchill was a man of words and instincts, and he had an instinct for symbols. He saw in the King and Queen a steady centre Britain desperately needed. He also saw very quickly that Elizabeth was the more emotionally persuasive of the pair. Her armour. It also became her addiction. Elizabeth and Churchill became close in the way powerful people become close when they need each other. Churchill needed the monarchy to hold the public, to keep morale stitched together. Elizabeth needed Churchill to keep the government aligned with the crown, to keep their authority unquestioned, to keep the monarchy from becoming a target. Their friendship was sincere in parts and strategic in others. Elizabeth could be charming to Churchill, praising his courage, laughing at his jokes, making him feel supported. Churchill, in return, treated her with a protective respect that fed her sense of importance. She liked that. She liked being consulted. She liked being treated as more than a decorative wife. She had always wanted influence, and war made influence feel like patriotism. Meanwhile, the ghost of Edward remained, and war gave that ghost sharper teeth. There were whispers, unpleasant and persistent, about the Duke of Windsor and his sympathies, about his friendships in Europe, about his behaviour that did not always align with Britain at war. In 1940 he was sent far away as governor of the Bahamas, a posting that looked like duty and felt like exile. Officially, it was an appointment. In practice, it was a way to move a potential embarrassment out of reach. Elizabeth approved of that distance with a satisfaction she did not need to. disguise in private. She had never forgiven Edward, and now she had another reason to hold him at arm's length. War turns old grudges into moral certainties. Elizabeth wrapped her spite in patriotism and found it fit beautifully. Wallis, now the Duchess of Windsor, remained the figure Elizabeth refused to accept. No matter how the world changed, Elizabeth would not grant her the style that would make her fully royal. It was not just rules, it was revenge disguised as principle. Albert sometimes tried gently to soften the family cruelty. He was not cruel by nature. He could feel guilt about Edward, about the way his brother had been cut away. Elizabeth answered that guilt with cold logic. She would remind him of the abdication. She would remind him of the humiliation. She would remind him that the monarchy was now fighting for survival on a global scale, and there was no room for soft sentiment toward a man who had once chosen personal pleasure over public duty. Albert would sigh and fall silent. He always fell silent when Elizabeth framed her will as duty. It was her favorite trick, and it worked because it was partly true. During the war years, Elizabeth became almost mythic. People spoke of her courage, her visits, her refusal to leave. They spoke of her as the heart of the nation. She cultivated that image with careful consistency. Even her smiles were disciplined. She did not allow herself to look tired in public, though she was tired. She did not allow herself to look frightened, though she had reason. She also did not allow herself to look diminished. The palace continued to function. Formality continued when possible. Clothes were still beautiful. Dinners were still proper when they could be. The monarchy tightened its belt publicly, but behind the scenes there were still standards, still expectations, still an insistence that royalty must look like royalty. Elizabeth privately struggled with rationing like a woman forced to share her wardrobe. She accepted the rules, but she disliked them. She disliked the constraints. She disliked having to be careful. She could be generous to others while still resenting anything that made her own life less comfortable. That contradiction did not trouble her. She could pity suffering and still feel entitled to ease. In her mind, entitlement was not a moral failing. It was her position. In 1945, when victory finally arrived in Europe, London erupted into joy that felt like a release of breath held for too long. Crowds gathered, sang, waved, cried, kissed strangers. The royal family appeared on the balcony, and the public roared as if the monarchy had personally won the war. Elizabeth waved and smiled, and in that moment she looked like the embodiment of relief. The irony was that relief did not bring peace inside the palace. It brought exhaustion. Albert had carried war on his shoulders, and he had done it with the same grim determination he brought to his speeches. But strain does not vanish when the sirens stop. Strain settles into the body. The king began to look older than his years. He smoked too much, worked too hard, refused to rest properly. Elizabeth nagged him about health in the way she nagged everyone, with a tone that sounded caring and also slightly irritated, as if illness were another inconvenience he was causing her. Post-war Britain was not a place of glitter. It was a place of shortages. Rebuilding, ration books, grey skies, and a public less patient with extravagance. The monarchy had survived, but it now had to justify itself in a changed world. Elizabeth responded the way she always did. She performed warmth, stability, family. She presented the crown as the comforting centre of a tired nation. She also quietly continued to spend in ways that made eyebrows rise behind polite smiles. People did not always see the bills, but people in the royal household saw enough to understand that Elizabeth did not like restraint. The girls grew into young women under this public gaze. Princess Elizabeth, now a teenager and then a young adult, became the focus of the monarchy future. She was dutiful, steady, careful. She was everything her mother wanted her to be in public. In private, she could be reserved, wary, as if she had learned early that emotion is a thing you guard. Princess Margaret, more lively, more emotional, became the family joy and the family trouble. Margaret loved attention. She loved parties. She loved being adored. Elizabeth encouraged it and scolded it in equal measure. She liked Margaret's sparkle because it made the monarchy feel glamorous. She feared Margaret Sparkle because sparkle can burn. During the war, Princess Elizabeth met Philip, a young naval officer with sharp features and an air of confidence that could feel like arrogance. He was not a British aristocrat in the comfortable old way. He had foreign relatives, a complicated family history, and a bluntness that sometimes looked like rudeness to people raised on soft manners. Elizabeth did not immediately adore him. She wanted a husband for her daughter who would fit neatly, who would be easy to present to the public, who would not bring awkward questions. Philip was not neat. Philip had opinions. Philip did not bend. The king, sentimental and fond of his daughter, was hesitant. Elizabeth, protective and controlling, was wary. But the young Princess Elizabeth was stubborn in her own quiet way. She loved Philip, and she did not love lightly. Elizabeth watched this and felt a familiar discomfort. Love again. Love again threatening to complicate duty. She had seen what love could do to a crown. She did not like being reminded. Still, Philip was not Wallace, and Elizabeth was too smart to turn her daughter's love into open battle, unless she had to. She pushed for caution, for time, for proper arrangements. She insisted on standards. She insisted that Philip become, in every public way possible, acceptable. The marriage went forward in 1947, and the public adored the romance. Elizabeth smiled beside her daughter at the wedding, playing the proud mother with perfect grace. In private, she did not easily surrender her position as the most important woman in her daughter's life. Queens, even future queens, have mothers. Elizabeth did not intend to become merely background. Then came the king's illness in the early 1950s, and once again the palace shifted into that hushed theatre of decline. Albert's health worsened. There were medical consultations, private worry, public appearances that looked strained. Elizabeth did not let the public see panic. She smiled, as always. She also clung to control more tightly, because when you cannot control death, you control everything else. In February 1952, the king died. Princess Elizabeth was in Kenya when she became queen, a young woman with a young family suddenly pulled into history. She returned to Britain as Queen Elizabeth II, and the country looked at her with hope and sympathy, and the same hunger it always has for a new story. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, now a widow, faced a question she did not enjoy. Who was she without the crown beside her husband? The answer became one of the most brilliant acts of self-creation in modern royal history. She became the Queen Mother. The title itself was practical, but the image was something Elizabeth shaped with care. She wore black with elegance. She allowed the public to see her grief in controlled glimpses. She became, in the national imagination, the brave widow who had stood through war, the mother of the young queen, the grandmother figure the country could love. It worked. It worked so well that it nearly erased everything else. But grief did not soften her into gentleness. If anything, grief hardened her. She had lost her husband, the man she had pushed, guided, sometimes bullied, the man she had built into a king. She mourned him sincerely. She also mourned the loss of being at the center of the reign. Her daughter was now the monarch, and the palace would revolve around a younger woman. Elizabeth did not enjoy being moved aside. She did what she always did when she felt threatened. She made herself indispensable. She offered advice. She offered comfort. She offered her experience. She offered her presence at events that could overwhelm a young queen. She stepped into the role of steady elder with such skill that people began to speak of her as a kind of national treasure. Inside the family, she could be more demanding. She expected deference from staff and from younger relatives. She expected her preferences to be considered. She expected her feelings to matter. She had always expected that. Now she expected it with the authority of widowhood and public affection behind her. Clarence House became her domain, and she ran it like a small court. She surrounded herself with loyal staff, loyal friends, and routines that kept her comfortable. She entertained. She went to the races. She enjoyed the social world, and she enjoyed being treated like the adored elder. She also, reportedly, continued to spend in ways that startled those who understood the private accounts. The country imagined her as frugal, wartime bravery. The household knew she loved luxury, and she rarely denied herself if denial felt unpleasant. She could be generous too. She gave gifts, she supported charities, she made appearances that mattered. But generosity and indulgence lived side by side in her, and she never found that contradiction troubling. Her relationship with her daughters changed in ways that were not always gentle. With the Queen, Elizabeth could be supportive and also subtly controlling. She offered advice in that sweet tone that made advice feel like expectation. She did not always approve of Philip's bluntness. She did not always approve of the Queen's willingness to listen to her husband. Elizabeth liked being the central voice in her daughter's private world, and she did not like competition. With Margaret, the dynamic was even messier. Margaret was the daughter most like her mother in temperament. Charming, emotional, hungry for affection, capable of dramatic moods. Elizabeth indulged Margaret, spoiled her, soothed her, and in doing so taught her that being beloved can excuse a lot. But when Margaret wanted something that threatened the monarchy, Elizabeth became ruthless. Margaret fell in love with Peter Townsend, a man older than her, a war hero, and crucially, divorced. The romance was whispered about, then openly discussed. The public watched with fascination. Margaret, passionate and stubborn, wanted to marry him. Elizabeth's reaction was immediate and fierce, even if it was delivered through polite channels. In her mind, this was the Wallace story returning, not with a king this time, but with her own daughter. Divorce again, scandal again, a royal marriage that could challenge the church and the institution again. Elizabeth could not bear it. It was not only principle, it was personal memory. She had lived through the abdication crisis, and she would not allow her family to repeat it. Margaret suffered. She waited. She hoped. She was pulled between love and duty in a way that echoed Edward, and that echo made Elizabeth harsher. She could not have her daughter compared to the man she despised most. The romance was managed, delayed, and eventually broken. Margaret announced she would not marry Townsend. The public mourned the love story. Margaret mourned it more deeply. Elizabeth, outwardly sympathetic, was inwardly relieved. Relief in her often looked like righteousness. This was Elizabeth in full. She could spoil a child and still deny her the one thing she wanted most. She could comfort and control in the same breath. She could be sentimental and severe, sometimes within the same conversation. Over the decades, her public image grew sweeter. She laughed. She attended events. She charmed crowds. She became the familiar figure in bright hats, the older lady who seemed to embody the idea of Britain itself. But privately she remained stubborn and easily offended. She held grudges. She expected special treatment. She could be unkind about people she disliked. She could dismiss with a word, freeze with a look, wound with a polite sentence. Her feelings about Edward never truly softened. Even when he grew older, even when his health failed, Elizabeth remained cold. When he died in 1972 in Paris, the family attended the funeral with the public dignity expected. Elizabeth behaved correctly. Correctness was her specialty. But correctness is not forgiveness, and those who knew her could feel that she never released the story in her mind. Edward had betrayed them. Edward had forced Albert into a short, stressful reign. Edward had threatened everything Elizabeth had built. She did not let that go. Wallace lived on as a kind of spectral figure, increasingly frail, increasingly secluded. Elizabeth did not reach out, she did not reconcile, she did not soften. In her world, some lines once crossed cannot be uncrossed. As the decades passed, the Queen Mother became a fixture, and fixtures are rarely examined closely. The public saw her longevity as charm. They saw her as a link to wartime courage, to a simpler sense of duty. They did not see the private machinery of her life, the staff, the preferences, the costs, the insistence on being treated as the most important person in the room, even when the room belonged to someone else. There were whispers late in her life about the state of her finances, about debts, about the cost of maintaining her lifestyle. People whispered because people always whisper about royalty money. Some of those whispers were exaggerated, some were not. What mattered was the pattern. Elizabeth had always believed the world should provide her comforts. Even as a beloved public figure, she did not truly change that belief. She suffered losses that would have softened some people. She lost friends, she lost her sister-in-law, Princess Marina, she lost her daughter Margaret in 2002. That loss cracked something in her. Margaret had been her sparkling mirror, her difficult darling, her child who carried both her charm and her trouble. When Margaret died, Elizabeth looked suddenly older, as if her body had been held together by will and habit was beginning to falter. Then, only weeks later, Elizabeth herself died on March 30th, 2002, at Royal Lodge in Windsor, aged 101. The public mourned as if they had lost a grandmother. They lined the streets. They wept. They spoke of her courage and her warmth. They remembered the Blitz, the smiling queen walking through rubble, the steady figure beside her stammering husband, the woman who refused to run. And all of that was true. But there was another truth too, quieter, less flattering, and much more human. She had been spoiled from childhood and never truly outgrew the expectation that the world should accommodate her. She had been selfish in her insistence on comfort and control, even when others paid the price in exhaustion and fear. She had been spiteful in the way she punished those who offended her, especially Edward and Wallace, and in the way she used moral language to justify personal revenge. She had been, at times, shockingly entitled, treating service as her right and disagreement as disrespect. She had also been brave and clever and disciplined and emotionally shrewd. She had held the monarchy together when it might have cracked, not only through courage but through sheer performance skill, the ability to give people what they needed to see. She had been, in other words, exactly what the institution required. Maybe that is the most uncomfortable part of her story. It is easy to admire a saint and easy to despise a villain. Elizabeth was neither. She was a woman shaped by privilege, sharpened by crisis, fueled by pride, and gifted with charm so strong it could become a national comfort. She understood something most people spend a lifetime learning. The world forgives many sins when you make it feel safe. In the end, she left behind more than hats and photographs and affectionate memories. She left a lesson written into the modern monarchy itself, a lesson her daughter and grandchildren would live with whether they liked it or not. Never let the public see you blink. Never let anyone think you need them more than they need you. And if the world tries to take your place from you, smile, hold your ground, and make the story turn in your favor, even if you have to harden your heart to do it.